Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is something appropriate, perhaps even necessary, about marking the moment when we turn our attention toward what has been deliberately left in darkness. This investigation concerns itself with a peculiar category of terror, not the cosmic entities that dominate Lovecraft scholarship, not Cthulhu, dreaming in R'lyeh, or Azathoth, bubbling at the universe's center, but rather those beings mentioned once and abandoned, those names whispered in fragmentary texts and never clarified, those presences that exist at the margins of even cosmic horror's most comprehensive mythologies. These are the forgotten ones, entities that appear in a single story, sometimes in a single sentence, then vanish from the literary record as though their mere documentation exhausted some finite capacity for human attention. We must ask ourselves, why Lovecraft, a writer obsessed with creating interconnected mythologies and false authenticities through cross-reference and repetition, would introduce cosmic forces only to abandon them entirely? Was this mere creative pragmatism, the natural pruning of an evolving fictional universe? Or does the act of forgetting, of allowing certain entities to slip through the cracks of even a constructed mythology, serve a deeper philosophical function? Over the next hour, we will examine the origins of these forgotten beings, their nature and function within Lovecraft's cosmic pessimism, their scattered appearances across his stories and those of his circle, and finally, their strange afterlife in modern culture. What we discover may suggest that the truly unbearable cosmic truth is not that humanity is insignificant, but that even gods can be forgotten, and we along with them. Howard Phillips Lovecraft wrote during a period of profound epistemological crisis, a moment in Western intellectual history when traditional frameworks for understanding humanity's place in the cosmos were collapsing under the weight of new discoveries. Between 1890 and 1937, the span of his lifetime, astronomy revealed galaxies beyond our own, physics dissolved matter into probability clouds, and anthropology demonstrated that human civilization represented merely a brief flicker in geological deep time. Lovecraft absorbed these developments with an almost religious intensity, transforming scientific materialism into a new aesthetic of cosmic dread. His letters reveal a man deeply committed to what he called cosmicism, the philosophical position that humanity occupies no special place in an indifferent universe, that our gods are projections, our meaning self-generated delusion, and our ultimate fate identical to that of trilobites or dinosaurs. This was not the posturing of a Gothic entertainer, but the sincere conviction of someone who had looked unflinchingly at early 20th century science and extracted from it a new foundation for horror literature. Within this larger project of cosmic atheism, Lovecraft developed a specific narrative strategy that has received insufficient scholarly attention. He constructed elaborate mythologies, inventing ancient texts, prehistoric civilizations, and pantheons of non-human entities, but he did so with deliberate incompleteness. The famous beings of his mythos, Cthulhu, and Nyarlathotep, and Yog-Sothoth, appear repeatedly across multiple stories, accruing layers of mythology through cross-reference and elaboration. But surrounding these central figures exists a penumbra of entities mentioned once or twice, never fully developed, sometimes contradicted by later stories, and frequently abandoned without explanation. These are not failures of creative follow-through, but rather evidence of sophisticated mythological construction. Lovecraft understood, perhaps instinctively, what anthropologists and comparative mythologists had been demonstrating throughout his lifetime. Authentic religious systems are always fragmentary, always containing references to deities whose cults have died out, whose attributes have been forgotten, whose very names survive only in corrupted form within the texts of successor civilizations. Consider what we know from Lovecraft's correspondence during the late 1920s and early 1930s, the period of his most intensive mythos construction. He wrote frequently to fellow writers Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Frank Belknap Long, and others about the importance of creating what he called an artificial mythology. The key word here is artificial. Lovecraft had no interest in establishing an actual occult tradition, but rather in simulating the textures and structures of real mythological systems so effectively that readers would experience a frisson of plausibility despite knowing the material was fictional. To achieve this effect, he needed not only the major deities with their established cults and extensive lore, but also the fragmentary references, the passing mentions of entities whose worship had supposedly died out millennia before even recorded human history began. These forgotten beings served as mythological ballast, lending authenticity through incompleteness, a mythology in which every entity is fully documented and systematically organized, reads as artificial, one filled with gaps, contradictions, and unresolved references mimics the actual archaeological and textual record of real religious systems. The question of creator intent becomes more complex when we examine which beings Lovecraft chose to develop and which he abandoned. Cthulhu, introduced in a 1928 story, became central to the mythos and appeared or was referenced in numerous subsequent works. Tsathoggua, created by Clark Ashton Smith but adopted by Lovecraft, similarly accrued a substantial body of lore. Yet entities like Abhoth, the source of uncleanliness, mentioned in Smith's The Seven Geeses, or the Magnum Innominandum, referenced in Lovecraft's own notes, never received such treatment, despite being conceptually no less horrifying or cosmically significant. Was this simply a matter of narrative utility? Cthulhu served well as a focal point for cults and ancient monuments. Perhaps other entities simply offered less obvious story potential. Or did Lovecraft recognize that cosmic horror functions more effectively when certain terrors remain genuinely obscure, when the mythology itself seems to have forgotten beings too ancient or too alien for even inhuman memory to retain? This strategy of deliberate abandonment creates a peculiar effect for readers encountering the mythos comprehensively. One discovers mentions of Atlach-Nasha, the spider being weaving reality together in some unspecified cavern, appearing in only a single Clark Ashton Smith story before vanishing from the literary record. The Hounds of Tindalos, Frank Belknap Long's contribution, chase their prey through angles of time, but Long wrote only one story about them, leaving their nature and origin almost entirely unspecified. These entities exist in a liminal space within the mythos, not obscure enough to be considered trivial Easter eggs for dedicated readers, but not developed enough to have coherent mythologies of their own. They represent, in effect, what the mythos itself has forgotten, what even Lovecraft's pseudo-scholarly narrators cannot fully document. This creates a secondary level of cosmic horror beyond the explicit content of any individual story. If even a constructed mythology designed by human writers proves incapable of maintaining coherent records of all its entities, What does this suggest about humanity's ability to comprehend the actual cosmos? The implications extend beyond mere literary technique into the philosophical territory Lovecraft occupied throughout his creative life. His worldview held that human consciousness itself was an accident, an evolutionary adaptation of no more cosmic significance than the compound eyes of insects or the echolocation of bats. If consciousness is accidental, then memory, individual and collective, must be equally contingent, equally fragile. The forgotten beings of his mythos thus serve as narrative embodiment of a darker premise, that oblivion is not merely the fate of individual organisms, but the ultimate destiny of all information, all meaning, all gods. Not every entity gets to be Cthulhu, eternally remembered and feared. Some are mentioned once in a corrupted manuscript and then slip beneath the horizon of cultural memory. And there is no cosmic injustice in this, because the universe possesses no mechanism for preserving anything permanently. We might call this the democratization of horror, applying to gods and cosmic entities the same inexorable entropy that physics promises will eventually claim stars, galaxies, and space itself. This foundational understanding of Lovecraft's intent in creating incompletely documented entities sets the stage for examining the cultural and philosophical traditions from which he drew. The forgotten beings were not innovations without precedent, but rather Lovecraft's synthesis of various early 20th century intellectual currents, all of which shared a preoccupation with obsolescence, with cultural memory and its failures, with the anxiety that modernity itself was a forgetting of something older and perhaps more terrible. Lovecraft did not invent the concept of forgotten deities from whole cloth, but rather synthesized it from multiple intellectual and literary traditions circulating through early 20th century culture. The late Victorian and Edwardian periods witnessed an explosion of interest in comparative mythology, archaeological discovery, and occult revival movements, all of which grappled with questions of cultural memory and its failures. Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough, published in multiple expanded editions between 1890 and 1915, documented dying god cults across world cultures, demonstrating that religions considered eternal and unchanging had in fact replaced earlier worship systems whose gods were now barely remembered. Fraser's work suggested something unsettling to its contemporary audience, that the Christian God himself might one day join the ranks of Zeus, Odin, and Marduk as mythological curiosities studied by future anthropologists. This anxiety about religious obsolescence permeated the intellectual atmosphere in which Lovecraft developed as a writer, providing a framework for thinking about divine forgetting as not merely possible, but inevitable. The Theosophical movement, which reached its peak influence during Lovecraft's formative years, contributed another crucial element to the conceptual genealogy of forgotten beings. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, and subsequent theosophical texts posited hierarchies of spiritual entities, the masters, the lords of karma, the planetary spirits, that supposedly guided human evolution from behind the scenes of recorded history. While Lovecraft held theosophy in contempt as superstitious nonsense, he absorbed its structural logic, the idea that Earth's history contained layers of non-human or pre-human intelligence, that current civilizations rested upon the foundations of predecessor races whose very existence had been forgotten, and that certain knowledge had been deliberately suppressed or had simply eroded beyond recovery. Theosophical literature, frequently referenced Atlantis, Lemuria, and other lost civilizations whose gods and cosmic hierarchies remained hidden from modern awareness. Lovecraft retained this architecture of hidden history while stripping away theosophy's spiritual optimism, replacing benevolent masters with indifferent or malevolent cosmic entities whose forgetting was not mystical concealment, but simple temporal erosion. Arthur Machen's fiction provided more immediate literary precedent for Lovecraft's forgotten beings, particularly in stories like The Great God Pan, 1894, and The White People, 1904. Machen wrote of Aboriginal deities surviving in remote British landscapes, of pre-Celtic and pre-human powers that conventional history had overlooked or suppressed. His little people were not charming fairies, but remnants of prehistoric races whose continued existence represented a kind of living fossil record, beings that should have been forgotten by evolutionary progress but persisted in hidden valleys and isolated woodlands. Machen's vision of Britain as a palimpsest, with older realities showing through beneath the surface of Victorian civilization, directly influenced Lovecraft's conception of the American landscape. Where Machen saw ancient Celtic and pre-Celtic survivals, Lovecraft imagined even older traces, the remnants of entities that held dominion over Earth before humanity's primate ancestors descended from the trees. The key innovation in both writers was making forgetting itself uncanny. The horror lay not in dramatic revelation, but in the slow recognition that what civilization had forgotten continued to exist, unnoticed and undocumented, in the margins of the known world. Lord Dunsany's fantasy fiction, which Lovecraft considered a major influence throughout his career, contributed the aesthetic template for gods abandoned by their worshippers. Stories like The Gods of Pagana, 1905, and Time and the Gods, 1906, depicted deities in decline, forgotten pantheons persisting in empty temples, and the eventual obsolescence of even cosmic powers. Dunsany wrote with a tone of melancholic beauty rather than horror, but his core insight resonated with Lovecraft's darker vision that gods depend upon worship for their relevance, if not their existence, and that the withdrawal of human attention constitutes a form of divine death. Lovecraft transformed this aesthetic concept into horror by emphasizing not pathos, but threat. His forgotten beings were not sad relics, but potential catastrophes, entities whose lack of worshippers made them no less dangerous, and perhaps more so, since no cult remained to appease them or warn of their nature. The absence of living tradition meant the absence of protective ritual, leaving modern discoverers entirely vulnerable to forces their ancestors had learned to avoid or contain. The philosophical pessimism of Arthur Schopenhauer and Eduard von Hartmann provided deeper theoretical justification for Lovecraft's mythology of forgetting. Schopenhauer's The World, as Will and Representation, 1818, argued that consciousness itself was a curse, that awareness brought only suffering, and that the universe's fundamental nature was blind, purposeless striving. Von Hartmann's Philosophy of the Unconscious, 1869, extended this into a cosmology where consciousness represented an aberration that the universe's unconscious depths worked constantly to eliminate. Lovecraft encountered these ideas through secondary sources and contemporary discussions rather than systematic philosophical study, but he absorbed their essential argument that the cosmos possessed no inherent meaning, that consciousness was an accident, and that oblivion represented not tragedy, but the natural state of things. His forgotten beings embodied this philosophy in narrative form. They were not punished with obscurity, but rather demonstrated that even entities of cosmic scope eventually succumb to the universe's fundamental tendency toward entropy and erasure. Friedrich Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead in The Gay Science, 1882, represented another philosophical current feeding into Lovecraft's conception of divine obsolescence, though with an ironic inversion. Nietzsche meant that European culture had killed its God through secularization and rationalism, that Christianity no longer functioned as civilization's organizing principle, even if individuals maintained personal faith. Lovecraft radicalized this insight by suggesting that the death of gods was not a cultural achievement, but a cosmic constant, that deities, like species, undergo extinction, and that the Judeo-Christian God was merely the most recent in a vast succession of forgotten divine regimes. His mythos imagined a universe where gods came and went like geological epochs, where the entities worshipped by pre-human civilizations had faded into obscurity long before humanity emerged, and where humanity's own gods would eventually join them in oblivion. This was not the empowering atheism of Nietzsche's Superman, but rather what we might call pessimistic polytheism, a vision of endless divine succession without progress or meaning, gods forgetting gods in infinite regress. The archaeological discoveries of Lovecraft's lifetime provided concrete imagery for these abstract philosophical concerns. The 1920s and 1930s witnessed spectacular finds: Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the Sumerian royal cemetery at Ur, continuing excavations of Mayan and Aztec sites that revealed sophisticated civilizations whose religions were now known only through fragmentary texts and ruined temples. These discoveries demonstrated viscerally that forgetting was not hypothetical, but historical fact, that entire cosmologies had flourished and disappeared, leaving behind only enough evidence to suggest how much had been lost. Lovecraft followed these developments closely, mining archaeological reports for details that could be repurposed into his fictional prehistory. The forgotten beings of his mythos occupied the same conceptual space as real forgotten gods like the Aztec Totec or the Sumerian Tiamat, entities that once commanded worship and sacrifice, but now existed only as names in academic texts, their true natures irretrievably lost. By placing his invented entities in the same category, Lovecraft achieved the effect of false authenticity that made his cosmic horror peculiarly unsettling. Readers could not quite shake the feeling that these beings might have genuinely existed and been forgotten, just as so many real gods had been. These various cultural and philosophical influences converged in Lovecraft's work to create a mythology predicated on incompleteness and erosion. His forgotten beings were not mere background decoration, but rather the logical consequence of taking cosmic pessimism and deep time seriously. If consciousness is accidental and meaning is illusory, then memory itself must be understood as a temporary and unreliable phenomenon, incapable of preserving even the most terrible truths permanently. The stage was thus set for examining how Lovecraft implemented these ideas through specific linguistic and symbolic strategies, creating names and concepts that sounded like they had been salvaged from some larger, mostly lost tradition. The names of Lovecraft's forgotten beings possess a peculiar linguistic quality that distinguishes them from both conventional fantasy nomenclature and the designations of better-known mythos entities. Consider the difference between Cthulhu and Abhoth, or between Nyarlathotep and Atlach-Nasha. The former pair appears regularly across multiple texts, accruing pronunciation guides, etymological speculation, and consistent orthography. The latter pair appears once or twice, never with clarification of linguistic origin, pronunciation, or meaning, and sometimes with variant spellings that suggest textual corruption rather than authorial consistency. This distinction is not accidental, but rather reflects Lovecraft's sophisticated understanding of how real mythological names survive across time and translation. The forgotten beings bear names that sound like they have been copied incorrectly from crumbling manuscripts, transliterated poorly from dead languages, or reconstructed uncertainly from fragmentary inscriptions. They carry within their very syllables the suggestion of information loss, of transmission failure across vast temporal and cultural distances. Lovecraft crafted these names using specific phonological strategies designed to evoke pre-human utterance. He favored consonant clusters that human vocal anatomy finds difficult, the T-shell of Atlach, the BH of Abhoth, the Juj of Tsathoggua, creating the impression that these words originated with beings possessing different mouths, different tongues, different breathing apparatuses. The theoretical linguist might note that these clusters violate phonotactic constraints common across human languages, suggesting either non-human origin or extreme antiquity predating the constraints themselves. Lovecraft reinforced this effect through inconsistent vowel usage and the inclusion of what might be consonants or might be diacritical marks lost in transcription. The name Obo-Sathla, for instance, contains that hyphen which might indicate a compound form, a glottal stop, or simply a copyist's uncertainty about where one phoneme ended and another began. These apparent inconsistencies serve a deliberate function. They make the names feel archaeologically discovered rather than artistically invented. The practice of creating words that sound authentically ancient while remaining completely fabricated has deep roots in esoteric and occult traditions that Lovecraft would have encountered even if he dismissed their supernatural claims. Medieval grimoires frequently included barbarous names of evocation, strings of syllables like Zazas, Zazas, Nasatanada, Zazas, from the Mathers edition of the Key of Solomon, which magicians claimed were angel or demon names in Enochian, Chaldean, or other primordial languages. These names functioned through sonority rather than semantic content. Their power supposedly derived from accurate pronunciation rather than understood meaning. Lovecraft appropriated this technique while inverting its purpose. Where the grimoires promised that correct utterance would grant power over spirits, Lovecraft suggested that some names remained fragmentary precisely because complete pronunciation would be dangerous or impossible, that the forgetting encoded in corrupted names protected humanity from forces we should not summon. The very incompleteness of names like Magnum Innominandum, the Great Unnamed, a designation that refuses to designate, becomes a form of apotropaic magic, warding off complete knowledge. Real-world examples of forgotten deities provided templates for Lovecraft's linguistic archaeology. The Sumerian goddess Tiamat survived into Babylonian mythology, but with her attributes and mythology substantially altered, her original nature lost to religious reformation. The pre-Olympian titans of Greek mythology, Cronus, Oceanus, Hyperion, retained their names, but little coherent mythology, their stories fragmented and contradictory across different sources. Celtic deities like Taranis and Tutatis appeared in Roman accounts, but only as names without detailed theological context, their cults evidently already in decline when Roman scribes bothered to document them at all. Lovecraft recognized that these real examples of divine forgetting shared certain characteristics. Names survived better than attributes. Individual deities persisted longer in memory than their relationships to each other, and the most ancient gods became increasingly abstract or elemental in surviving accounts, as though the specific personalities had eroded first, leaving only vague associations with natural forces. He replicated these patterns of degradation in his invented mythology, ensuring that beings like Abhoth, source of uncleanliness, retained elemental associations, but almost no narrative mythology, exactly as we might expect from a genuinely ancient and mostly forgotten cult. The concept of pre-human syllables represents perhaps Lovecraft's most theoretically sophisticated contribution to horror linguistics. In stories like The Shadow Out of Time and At the Mountains of Madness, he depicted languages that predated humanity by millions or even billions of years, implying that the phonological range of these languages might exceed what human vocal apparatus could produce or human hearing could distinguish. The whistling language of the elder things, the piping of the Shoggoths, and the various unpronounceable utterances scattered throughout his fiction suggest that when human scholars attempt to transcribe these sounds, they necessarily fail, creating names that are approximations, corruptions, fundamentally inadequate translations of acoustic phenomena that human language lacks the capacity to capture. This provides elegant explanation for why the names appear strange. They are not truly names at all, but rather desperate attempts to represent, in human phonemes, something that originates outside the evolutionary history that shaped human language. The forgotten beings remain partially forgotten even when referenced, because their true names lie beyond the boundaries of human linguistic possibility. Lovecraft's technique influenced how subsequent writers approached the creation of ancient or alien nomenclature, though many failed to grasp the underlying principle. Post-Lovecraft mythos fiction frequently includes elaborate etymologies for entity names, providing linguistic derivations and pronunciation guides that actually undermine the effect Lovecraft achieved through ambiguity. When August Derleth systematized the mythos in the 1950s and 1960s, he provided clear taxonomies and relationships, turning Lovecraft's suggestive fragments into organized hierarchies. This represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how the forgotten beings functioned literarily. Their power derived precisely from inadequate documentation, from the sense that they existed at the limits of what could be known or articulated. The moment a name receives definitive pronunciation and clear etymological derivation, it loses the quality of having been imperfectly salvaged from pre-human antiquity and becomes instead merely another fantasy name, invented rather than discovered. The difference between Tsathoggua in Clark Ashton Smith's original story, mysterious, multiply spelled, suggesting lost knowledge, and Tsathoggua in the 1980s gaming supplements, fully taxonomized with stats and ecology, illustrates how systematization kills the very ambiguity that generated horror. Modern comparative linguistics provides frameworks for understanding what Lovecraft intuited about language death and the fossilization of divine names. When languages go extinct, they leave behind loanwords, place names, and proper nouns embedded in successor languages, fragmentary evidence of larger systems that can no longer be reconstructed. The pre-Greek substrate hypothesis, for instance, suggests that Greek contains many words of non-Indo-European origin, remnants of languages spoken by populations predating the arrival of Greek-speaking peoples. These substrate words often show unusual phonological features for Greek, marking them as foreign imports from lost linguistic traditions. Lovecraft essentially applied this concept to cosmic rather than human timescales, imagining that human languages themselves might contain substrate remnants from pre-human sources, names of beings so ancient that they predate not just particular human languages, but the human capacity for language itself. The forgotten beings occupy this linguistic substrate, their names preserving just enough of pre-human reality to suggest the vastness of what has been lost. The philosophical implications extend beyond mere literary technique into questions of epistemology and the limits of knowledge. If some entities genuinely exist beyond the capacity of human language to name them accurately, then they must also exist beyond the capacity of human thought to conceptualize them fully. Language and thought are deeply entangled. We think in words, and the vocabulary available to us constrains what thoughts we can formulate. A being whose name cannot be pronounced in human phonemes might represent something that cannot be understood through human cognitive categories. This suggests a hierarchy of forgetting. First, the detailed mythology is lost, then the attributes and associations, then the name degrades to uncertain phonemes, and finally, even the degraded name disappears, leaving only a gap in the mythological record, a place where something once was, now marked only by its absence. Lovecraft's forgotten beings occupy various positions along this spectrum of Rosha, some still retaining corrupted names, others reduced to designations like the nameless thing, or references to entities that must not be specified. This creates a mythology of negative space, where what has been forgotten becomes as important as what remains. Lovecraft's most enduring innovation in horror fiction was not any individual monster or cosmic entity, but rather his method of creating false authenticity through systematic cross-reference and mock scholarship. He understood that a single story about a fictional deity remains obviously fictional, no matter how vividly described or philosophically sophisticated. But when multiple stories reference the same entity, when different characters in different contexts encounter the same forbidden texts, when footnotes cite non-existent authorities and archaeological discoveries align across separate narratives, the accumulated effect generates a troubling plausibility. This technique reached its apotheosis in his treatment of forgotten beings, entities mentioned casually as though the reader should already know them, referenced in fragments of in-universe scholarship, and then never clarified or explained. The refusal to provide exposition became itself a form of authentication. Real mythologies, after all, do not pause to explain themselves to outsiders. They assume shared cultural knowledge. They reference entities without introduction, and they contain gaps where information has been lost to time. Lovecraft replicated these qualities so effectively that readers sometimes struggled to distinguish his inventions from actual occult traditions. The Necronomicon serves as the primary vehicle for this technique, functioning as a full source text that Lovecraft and his circle could reference to create the illusion of scholarly depth. Supposedly authored by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in the 8th century, translated into Greek as Necronomicon by Theodorus Philetas in 950 CE, then into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228, the grimoire's fictional publication, history mimics real medieval manuscripts with their complex transmission networks and multiple corrupted versions. Lovecraft scattered references to the Necronomicon throughout his stories, having characters consult specific passages, cite particular editions, and occasionally quote brief excerpts that invariably concern cosmic entities and prehistoric revelations. The genius of the device lay in what Lovecraft chose not to do with it. He never wrote the Necronomicon itself, never produced the full text that his stories kept referencing. This absence made it more believable, not less. Real forbidden texts are fragmentary, contradictory, lost to fire or censorship or simple decay. By keeping the Necronomicon perpetually offstage, Lovecraft made it feel more authentic than any fabricated grimoire he might have actually written could have been. Within this framework, the forgotten beings occupied a specific narrative position. They appeared in the most fragmentary passages, the most corrupted sections, the footnotes that reference sections now lost. When Lovecraft's narrators encountered references to Abhoth or the Hounds of Tindalos, these mentions typically came hedged with scholarly uncertainty. A being referred to in the fragmented Pnakotic manuscripts as, or an entity whose name appears in corrupted form in the Aralaya text. This framing simultaneously introduced the entity and excused its lack of elaboration. The narrator was working from incomplete sources, attempting to reconstruct mythology from archaeological rubble, and naturally some pieces remained missing or illegible. This mirrored actual scholarly practice in mythology studies and archaeology, where researchers regularly encounter deity names without supporting context, temple ruins without identifying inscriptions, or religious practices documented only through hostile outsider accounts. By replicating these conditions of uncertainty, Lovecraft made his invented entities feel like genuine discoveries awaiting proper documentation rather than fictional creations awaiting development. The technique of casual reference proved particularly effective for establishing authenticity through apparent familiarity. When Lovecraft wrote lines like "the doles that burrow beneath," he provided no explanation of what doles were, what their relationship to other entities might be, or why their burrowing should concern anyone. The sentence assumes the reader already possesses contextual knowledge, treating the entity as common currency within the story's world, rather than a novelty requiring exposition. This approach appears throughout weird fiction of the period, but rarely with Lovecraft's discipline. Many writers who attempted similar techniques would eventually break down and provide the exposition anyway, reassuring readers that they had not missed crucial information. Lovecraft resisted this impulse, allowing references to remain cryptic across multiple stories. The doles receive slightly more detail in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, but never achieve full explanation, remaining perpetually on the edge of the narrative's focus. This restraint signals confidence in the material, an attitude of, if you know, and if you don't, perhaps you're better off. It positions the reader as either insider or outsider to forbidden knowledge, creating an uncomfortable dynamic where comprehension itself becomes implicated in cosmic horror. The collaborative dimension of Lovecraft's myth building expanded the technique's effectiveness considerably. When Robert E. Howard referenced Lovecraft's invented entities in his own stories, and when Lovecraft reciprocated by mentioning Howard's contributions, the cross-pollination created the impression of independent corroboration. If multiple authors writing in different contexts all reference the same forbidden texts and entities, surely there must be some underlying reality to these repeated elements. This illusion of independent discovery was enhanced by the fact that Lovecraft and his correspondents deliberately introduced variations and contradictions into their shared mythology. Clark Ashton Smith's Tsathoggua differed slightly from Lovecraft's version. The Necronomicon passages, quoted by different authors, sometimes contradicted each other. Entity names appeared with alternate spellings, suggesting different transliteration conventions. These inconsistencies paradoxically strengthened the false authenticity because real mythological traditions always contain such variations. Different cult centers preserve different versions of the same god's mythology. Scribal errors corrupt transmission. Translation choices reflect theological agendas. The variations signaled that the mythos existed independently of any single author's control, as though Lovecraft and his circle were documenting rather than inventing their shared cosmology. Lovecraft's narrative strategy deliberately exploited the distinction between major and minor entities within his invented pantheon, a distinction that mirrors real-world religious hierarchies. Major gods like Cthulhu warranted extensive treatment because they maintained active cults with living, if degenerate, worshippers, monuments still standing, if submerged or isolated, and coherent mythologies preserved in multiple sources. The forgotten beings, by contrast, appeared in the margins because they had lost their cults, their monuments had crumbled beyond recognition, and their mythologies survived only in fragmentary form, if at all. This created narrative justification for the asymmetric treatment. Of course, we know more about Cthulhu than about Siega. Cthulhu's followers have maintained continuity across eons, while Siega's worshippers died out or forgot their own god. The uneven documentation became part of the world building rather than a flaw in it. Readers could not complain about underdeveloped entities because that underdevelopment was thematically appropriate. To fully document the forgotten beings would be to contradict their essential nature as forgotten. The technique of the discovered manuscript, a convention stretching back through Gothic fiction to 18th century novels, received sophisticated treatment in Lovecraft's hands, specifically regarding forgotten entities. His narrators frequently claim to be editing or translating documents they have discovered, adding footnotes to explain archaic terminology or obscure references. When these documents mention forgotten beings, the editorial apparatus typically includes scholarly hedging. The entity referred to here by the possibly corrupt name Atlach-Nacha appears in no other known source. Such editorial interventions frame the entity as a philological problem rather than a narrative element, shifting the reader's attention from "what is this being?" to "how reliable is this text's preservation of ancient knowledge?" The question becomes not whether the being exists, but whether we can reconstruct accurate understanding from fragmentary evidence. This substitution of epistemological for ontological doubt proves more philosophically sophisticated and ultimately more disturbing because it acknowledges that truth might exist beyond our capacity to access it reliably. The principle of the iceberg, showing only a fraction of the constructed mythology while implying vast hidden depths, governed Lovecraft's treatment of all his invented material, but applied with particular force to forgotten beings. When he mentioned the spawn of the goat with 1,000 young, or referenced the obscene fertility rituals of the Yithian epoch. He was not working from detailed notes about these elements that he could have included if space permitted. In most cases, these phrases represented the entirety of his conception, isolated images or concepts that he deployed precisely because they remained undeveloped. The iceberg effect emerged not from hiding a fully realized mythology, but from creating the impression that such a mythology existed and could theoretically be recovered through sufficient research. This technique acknowledged a truth about actual mythological research. Scholars frequently encounter references to deities or practices that cannot be elaborated because the sources simply do not exist. Every mythology contains such gaps, places where we know something existed but cannot reconstruct what it was. Lovecraft's genius lay in recognizing that fictional mythology gains authenticity by incorporating similar gaps, by admitting areas of ignorance and uncertainty rather than attempting comprehensive documentation. The long-term consequence of these narrative techniques was the emergence of what scholars now call the Cthulhu mythos, though Lovecraft never used this term and might have objected to the systematization it implied. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and posthumous collaborator, began organizing Lovecraft's scattered references into coherent taxonomies and hierarchies, creating the impression of an organized cosmology with clear relationships between entities and consistent metaphysical principles. This organizational impulse fundamentally misunderstood what made Lovecraft's mythology effective as horror. The forgotten beings were not puzzle pieces awaiting proper arrangement, but rather intentional gaps, places where the mythology acknowledged its own incompleteness. By attempting to fill these gaps, to promote forgotten entities to fully documented status, later systematizers eliminated the very quality that made them disturbing. A mysterious entity that appears once and vanishes generates lingering unease. That same entity, given full stats, relationships, and motivations in a role-playing game, supplement becomes just another monster. The professionalization of the mythos into a shared intellectual property with wikis, concordances, and official timelines represents perhaps the ultimate irony. The forgetting has been forgotten, replaced by the comforting illusion that everything can be known and catalogued if we simply compile enough reference material. The forgotten beings of Lovecraft's mythos embody a philosophical principle more disturbing than mere cosmic indifference: the inevitability of obsolescence at every scale of existence. Traditional cosmic horror relies upon humanity's insignificance in an uncaring universe, the revelation that we are insects beneath the notice of greater powers. But the forgotten entities push this logic one step further, suggesting that even the cosmic powers themselves are subject to erasure, that gods can be forgotten just as thoroughly as the civilizations that worship them, and that no entity, regardless of its power, antiquity, or alien nature, escapes the universe's tendency toward entropy and information loss. This represents what we might call meta-cosmic horror, the terror of discovering that even the framework of terror itself is temporary, that Cthulhu's eventual awakening matters only because we happen to exist during a narrow temporal window when Cthulhu remains culturally relevant. Wait another billion years, and whatever entities dominate that era will have no memory of the great old ones, just as the great old ones have apparently forgotten or never known the entities that preceded them. Deep time functions differently in the context of forgotten beings than it does elsewhere in Lovecraft's fiction. Stories like The Call of Cthulhu or At the Mountains of Madness invoke geological and astronomical timescales to emphasize humanity's brevity, but they treat their central entities as essentially immortal, unchanging across eons. Cthulhu waits in his house at R'lyeh. The elder things lie frozen in Antarctic cities, and while civilizations rise and fall around them, these beings themselves persist in recognizable form. The forgotten entities introduce genuine temporal erosion into this picture. Abhoth bubbles in caverns beneath Mount Vor-Mithridreth, but how long has it been since anyone worshipped it, since anyone could articulate what it represents beyond vague associations with primordial uncleanness? The hounds of Tyndalis pursue their prey through angles of time, but the origin and purpose have been lost, even to those scholars of the mythos who acknowledge their existence. These are not eternal beings that happen to be ignored, but rather entities undergoing a form of cosmic decay, losing coherence and definition as time erodes the cultural and textual structures that once gave them meaning. The concept of entropic mythology, the idea that mythological systems themselves degrade and lose information over time, challenges the fantasy convention of ancient lore as reliable guide. In conventional fantasy literature, ancient texts typically contain accurate information. The wizard's dusty tome tells the hero exactly how to defeat the Dark Lord, because knowledge in fantasy universes tends toward preservation rather than corruption. Lovecraft inverted this expectation ruthlessly. His ancient texts are fragmentary, contradictory, corrupted by poor translation and deliberate suppression. The Necronomicon is not a reliable guide to cosmic reality, but rather a damaged artifact that raises more questions than it answers, and the entities it mentions in passing are often the most unreliably documented of all. This creates a peculiar epistemological situation for characters within the stories. They know that forgotten beings exist because the texts reference them, but they cannot know what these beings are, what their relationship to better documented entities might be, or whether the beings still exist in any meaningful sense. The mythology itself has forgotten its own contents, leaving only tantalizing and potentially misleading fragments. We must pause here to consider the hierarchy of forgetting that structures Lovecraft's cosmos, because it reveals something profound about his philosophical commitments. At the bottom of this hierarchy sit individual humans who will be forgotten within generations. Above them sit civilizations, which might persist in archaeological record for millennia, but will eventually be misunderstood or lost entirely. Above civilizations sit the major gods like Cthulhu, who might be remembered across millions of years, but who represent relatively recent phenomena in cosmic terms. And somewhere in the upper reaches of this hierarchy exist the truly ancient entities, beings so old that even the elder things, who predate humanity by hundreds of millions of years, have only fragmentary records of them. Yet even these eldest entities show signs of degradation, their names uncertain, their natures ambiguous, their very existence questionable. This suggests that forgetting is not simply a human limitation, but a fundamental property of the universe itself, that information decays at all scales, and that even cosmic-level consciousness cannot prevent eventual erasure. The philosophical implications extend into questions about the relationship between existence and memory, between being and being known. Does a god cease to exist when all memory of it fades, or does it persist in some diminished form, its power dependent upon worship and recognition? Lovecraft's writings suggest multiple positions on this question, sometimes implying that the entities exist entirely independently of human awareness, other times hinting that forgetting constitutes a form of imprisonment or weakening. The ambiguity itself proves philosophically productive because it forces readers to confront the possibility that existence might not be binary, that beings could occupy states between full presence and complete absence, neither entirely real nor entirely unreal, sustained in partial form by fragmentary memory. The forgotten beings exist in this liminal zone, too attenuated to manifest fully, but not quite erased completely. Traces of something that once possessed greater definition. Lovecraft's personal philosophical commitments to mechanistic materialism complicated his presentation of these ideas in interesting ways. He claimed to believe that consciousness was an accidental product of matter's organization, that no spirits or supernatural agencies existed, and that the universe followed deterministic physical laws. Yet his fiction consistently explored scenarios where consciousness persisted in unexpected forms, where matter organized itself according to principles that violated human intuition, and where entities existed that could not be reconciled with materialist ontology. The forgotten beings represent perhaps his most sophisticated attempt to reconcile cosmic horror with materialism. They are not supernatural, but rather insufficiently natural, their nature so alien to human experience that attempting to categorize them as matter or energy or consciousness fails, because those categories assume a human-centric physics. They are forgotten not because they have died or departed, but because the cognitive frameworks necessary to conceptualize them have eroded, leaving behind only the barest traces of recognition that something existed, something vast, something we can no longer adequately name or imagine. The ultimate implication of this philosophy cuts deeper than traditional nihilism or existentialism. Those positions maintain that human meaning is constructed, that the universe contains no inherent purpose, but they typically preserve human consciousness as the site where meaning-making occurs. Lovecraft's forgotten beings suggest that even this residual humanism is too optimistic, that consciousness itself, human or otherwise, cannot preserve meaning against cosmic timescales, that even the act of bearing witness proves futile when witnesses themselves succumb to the same entropic forces that claim everything else. We are not simply insignificant observers of an uncaring cosmos, but rather temporary and unreliable witnesses whose testimony will be lost. Our entire civilization's intellectual achievements eventually reduced to the same fragmentary and corrupted status as the references to Abhoth in the Necronomicon. This is not merely cosmic horror, but cosmic tragedy. The recognition that nothing, not even the recognition itself, can be preserved indefinitely. The catalogue of forgotten beings within Lovecraft's mythos and its collaborative extensions defies systematic organization, which is precisely the point. These are entities that resist taxonomic clarity, that exist at the margins of even the most comprehensive mythological registers. We can, however, examine several exemplary cases that illustrate the range of forgetting, from beings that retain some coherent association to those reduced to mere names or nameless references. Each entity represents a different modality of cosmic horror, a distinct philosophical problem disguised as a monster, and collectively they map the topology of what lies beyond human comprehension and documentation. The very act of cataloging them here constitutes a kind of betrayal of their nature, an attempt to organize what should remain fragmentary, yet the exercise reveals patterns in how Lovecraft and his circle conceived of entities too ancient or alien for complete mythology. Atlach Nasha, the spider creature introduced in Clark Ashton Smith's The Seven Geeses, occupies abandoned caverns beneath the mythical land of Hyperborea, eternally weaving a great web between the physical world and some unspecified abyss. The entity's purpose remains deliberately obscure. Is the web meant to keep something out, or to create a bridge for something to cross? Smith never clarified, and Lovecraft adopted the entity into his own correspondence without elaboration. What makes Atlach Nasha particularly effective as a forgotten being is the incompleteness of its mythology. Despite its vivid imagery, we have a clear picture of what it does, but no understanding of why, no indication of its origin or ultimate goal, and no sense of what relationship it bears to other cosmic entities. The spider appears in Smith's story only briefly, glimpsed by characters who do not survive to report their findings, ensuring that within the fictional universe itself, the entity remains poorly documented. This creates a perfect example of the forgotten being paradox. We know enough to be disturbed, but not enough to understand, enough to recognize significance, but not enough to articulate what that significance means. Abhoth, the source of uncleanliness, represents an even more primordial form of forgotten entity, less a discrete being than a principle of generation, described in Smith's work as bubbling protoplasm that spawns lesser creatures in a cycle of creation and reabsorption. The entity supposedly existed before biological organization as we understand it, a prebiotic fountain of life that produces organisms without purpose or design. Smith's descriptions emphasize its formlessness and its location in caverns at the roots of Mount Vor-Mithridreth, but he provides no mythology explaining how it came to be, what relationship it holds to other primordial entities, or whether it possesses anything resembling consciousness or intent. The name itself, Source of Uncleanliness, functions more as accusation than designation, a human judgment projected onto something that predates the categories of clean and unclean. Abhoth exists in the mythos as pure image without interpretation, a biological horror divorced from any explanatory framework, and this lack of context makes it more unsettling than many better documented entities. We cannot approach Abhoth through cult practice or forbidden ritual because no tradition survives to provide such protocols. We can only stumble upon it and recoil. Obo-Sathla, another Smith creation, pushes the concept of primordial source even further into the realm of the genuinely alien. Described as the unbegotten source in Smith's Obo-Sathla, this entity supposedly exists at the beginning of Earth's biological history, a protoplasmic mass containing within itself all future life in potential form. The story presents Obo-Sathla as something like a biological singularity, the ultimate ancestor from which even the elder things might have descended. Yet it provides no explanation of how this entity relates to cosmic evolution, whether it represents the only source of life or merely Earth's particular manifestation of some universal principle. The entity possesses tablets of knowledge that supposedly contain all wisdom, past and future, but these tablets cannot be read or understood by human consciousness. They exist as conceptual objects rather than actual readable texts. This detail captures perfectly the epistemological problem of forgotten beings. They may contain profound significance, may represent ultimate truths about existence, but the apparatus necessary to decode that significance has been lost or never existed in human form. The Hounds of Tyndalos, introduced in Frank Belknap Long's 1929 story of the same name, represent a temporal rather than spatial form of forgotten entity. Long described them as beings that exist in angles rather than curves, that hunt through time itself rather than through space, pursuing those who have traveled through the fourth dimension without proper protection. The hounds supposedly predate the emergence of curved forms in the universe. They originate from an era when reality was all sharp angles, and they regard curved beings like humans as abominations to be eliminated. This ontologically creative concept received minimal development beyond the original story. We never learn what the hounds truly are, whether they possess intelligence or operate on instinct, what their relationship to time's structure might be, or why they specifically target time travelers. Long's reluctance or inability to elaborate transformed the hounds into perfect forgotten entities, vivid and memorable in their single appearance, but fundamentally unexplained, their nature irreducible to comfortable categories like predator or guardian or demon. Several entities exist at an even more extreme level of forgetting, beings mentioned so briefly and with such minimal context that they function primarily as names attached to dread. Siega, the destroying eye, appears in scattered references as an entity imprisoned beneath ancient Africa, capable of petrifying with its gaze, but almost no narrative material exists to flesh out its mythology. Ghatanothoa, briefly mentioned in Lovecraft's Out of Aeons, possesses the ability to petrify victims while leaving them conscious inside paralyzed bodies, and supposedly inspired ancient worship in Mu before being bound on a mountain. The Magnum Innominandum, the Great Unnamed, receives mention in some texts as an entity literally too terrible to name, though whether this represents genuine ontological unnamability or simply reflects the loss of its original designation remains unclear. These entities occupy the far end of the forgetting spectrum, reduced to bullet points in mythological registers, significant enough to have been recorded, but not significant enough, or too dangerous, to have been documented in detail. The category of formless spawn and lesser entities presents additional complications for taxonomic clarity. Lovecraft and his circle frequently referenced beings that existed as categories rather than individuals: the spawn of Shub-Niggurath, the servants of the Great Old Ones, the worms of the earth, without clarifying whether these phrases designated specific species, classes of beings, or simply poetic descriptions of phenomena that defied biological classification. This strategic vagueness served important mythological functions, suggesting that the cosmos contained layers of entities between the major gods and ordinary life, a middle kingdom of quasi-divine beings whose exact nature depended on context and interpretation. The forgotten beings often existed in this taxonomic uncertainty, too organized to be dismissed as natural phenomena, but too poorly documented to receive clear categorical placement. Are the deep ones of Innsmouth the same species as the beings of Ib mentioned in The Doom That Came to Sarnath? The texts provide insufficient information to decide, and this insufficiency itself becomes atmospheric, a mythology so ancient and corrupted that basic questions of identity and relationship cannot be definitively resolved. What unites these diverse entities is not shared ontology or common origin, but rather their position within the mythological economy Lovecraft constructed. They represent the overflow, the excess entities that could not be fully incorporated into the core mythos, but that needed to exist to make that core feel authentic and embedded in deeper history. Each forgotten being implies a vast narrative that could theoretically be told. The rise and fall of Atlach-Natcha's worshippers, the discovery and sealing of Sierra, the wars between the hounds of Tindalos and some other temporal species. But these narratives remain perpetually theoretical, gestured toward, but never actualized. This creates a peculiar effect for readers encountering the mythos comprehensively, a sense that every documented story sits atop geological layers of undocumented stories, that every entity mentioned implies dozens more that have been forgotten entirely, and that the true scope of cosmic horror lies not in what has been revealed, but in what remains permanently obscured. The forgotten beings are not supplementary material, but essential infrastructure, the foundation of missing information that makes the visible mythology credible. The encounter between human consciousness and forgotten beings follows a distinctive pattern across Lovecraft's fiction and its extensions, one that differs significantly from interactions with better documented entities like Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep. When characters confront the major mythos gods, they typically do so within frameworks provided by existing cults, forbidden texts, or archaeological traditions that, however fragmentary, offer some interpretive scaffolding. The cultist of Cthulhu may go mad, but he goes mad within a tradition of madness, surrounded by others who share his derangement and can articulate its nature. The scholar who reads about Yog-Sothoth in the Necronomicon encounters horror, but horror that has been linguistically domesticated through description and categorization. Forgotten beings allow no such mediation. Characters who stumble upon them do so without preparation, without tradition to contextualize the experience, and without language adequate to the encounter. The resulting madness is not interpretive derangement, but rather cognitive collapse, the mind confronting something for which it possesses no processing mechanisms whatsoever. The archaeological mode of discovery predominates in forgotten being narratives, emphasizing the accidental and unprepared nature of these encounters. Lovecraft's characters rarely seek out entities like Aboth or Atlach-Natcha deliberately. Instead, they excavate pre-human ruins, translate fragmentary manuscripts, or explore isolated regions where human presence has been minimal. The discovery occurs as byproduct of other investigations. The geologist examining unusual rock formations stumbles into caverns that should not exist. The philologist attempting to translate an ancient text encounters references to entities unnamed in any other source. The explorer of Antarctica discovers murals depicting beings that predate the elder things themselves. This pattern reflects Lovecraft's understanding that genuine horror resides not in what we seek, but in what we find unintentionally, the revelation that shatters whatever comforting narrative motivated the original quest. The forgotten beings are never the object of the search, but always its unfortunate conclusion, the thing that was not supposed to still exist, but which, impossibly, persists at the margins of the known world. Madness in these contexts functions less as psychological breakdown than as protective mechanism, a mercy killing of consciousness that can no longer process its own perceptions. Consider the typical progression. The character encounters evidence of the forgotten being. perhaps a statue unlike any known art tradition, a reference in a text that makes no sense within established mythological frameworks, or a physical trace that violates biological and geological principles. Initial response tends toward rationalization. Surely this is a known entity poorly preserved. Surely the text has been corrupted in transmission. Surely conventional science can explain these anomalies given sufficient investigation. But as evidence accumulates, rationalization fails. The entity does not fit existing categories, possesses attributes that contradict basic assumptions about matter and consciousness, and seems to violate not merely scientific laws, but the deeper regularities that make laws possible. At this point, the mind faces an impossible choice: integrate information that cannot be integrated, or reject perception itself. Madness represents the second option, a kind of cognitive bankruptcy declaration where the entire interpretive apparatus shuts down rather than continuing to process unprocessable data. The fragmentary nature of human contact with forgotten beings creates a peculiar documentation problem within the stories themselves. Characters who encounter these entities rarely survive to provide detailed accounts, and when they do survive, their testimony proves unreliable or incomplete. The archaeologist who glimpses Tiega's eye may petrify mid-revelation, his journal ending mid-sentence with no subsequent writer to complete the thought. The translator who discovers references to the Magnum Innominandum may destroy his own notes in horror, leaving only second-hand reports from colleagues who observed his breakdown but never read the texts themselves. This ensures that within the fictional universe, forgotten beings remain forgotten. Each encounter fails to produce the documentation necessary to transform unknown into known, mysterious into catalogued. The narrative structure itself enforces forgetting through systematic elimination of witnesses and evidence, suggesting that some entities resist incorporation into human knowledge, not through active opposition, but through the simple fact that encountering them prevents the survival or sanity of potential documentarians. The role of cultists in forgotten being narratives diverges sharply from their function in stories about major mythos entities. The cults of Cthulhu maintain traditions, preserve artifacts, and pass down worship practices across generations. They represent degenerate communities, certainly, but communities nonetheless, social structures that have successfully transmitted forbidden knowledge over time. Cultists of forgotten beings, by contrast, appear as isolates or tiny groups cut off from any larger tradition, frequently unaware of what exactly they worship or why. They have inherited fragments, a statue whose meaning they no longer understand, a ritual whose original purpose they have forgotten, a location they know is significant without comprehending its significance. Their worship is cargo cult religion, the mechanical repetition of forms whose content has been lost. This makes them more pathetic than threatening, and infinitely more disturbing, because they demonstrate that even dedicated religious transmission fails when the entity at the tradition center is sufficiently ancient or alien. If those who actively worship cannot maintain coherent mythology about their God, what hope has the casual discoverer of understanding what he has found? The progression from discovery to death or madness follows a structure so consistent across these narratives that it takes on ritual significance. First comes the fragmentary evidence, the inexplicable artifact, the problematic text. the geological impossibility. This generates curiosity, the academic or exploratory impulse to understand, to incorporate the anomaly into existing frameworks. Second comes the accumulation of evidence that resists incorporation, multiple sources pointing towards something, none providing clarity, all generating more questions than answers. This produces frustration, but also obsession. The character becomes invested in solving a mystery that may be unsolvable. Third comes the direct encounter or revelation, the moment when the entity itself becomes manifest, or its nature becomes undeniable. This shatters existing cognitive frameworks entirely. Fourth comes the attempt to communicate or document the discovery, which invariably fails. The character dies, goes mad, or discovers that language itself lacks the resources to convey what he has experienced. This final stage completes the cycle of forgetting, ensuring that the next discoverer will face identical ignorance and identical danger. We must recognize that this structure serves specific philosophical purposes within Lovecraft's larger project. The repeated failure of documentation, the systematic elimination of witnesses, and the inadequacy of language all reinforce the position that some aspects of reality lie permanently beyond human comprehension. This is not merely a failure of our current scientific paradigms, but a more fundamental incompatibility between human cognition and cosmic reality. The forgotten beings remain forgotten not because we have not yet developed adequate methods of study, but because adequacy itself is impossible, because the gap between human consciousness and these entities exceeds any gap that further evolution or technological advancement might bridge. This represents perhaps Lovecraft's most pessimistic philosophical commitment, not simply that the universe is indifferent to humanity, but that the universe contains phenomena that human consciousness, by its very structure and limitations, can never successfully model or remember. We are not merely insignificant, but also constitutionally incapable of grasping the full scope of our insignificance, doomed to forget what we discover and to have our discoveries forgotten after us. The concept of forbidden knowledge undergoes distinctive transformation when applied to forgotten beings rather than to better documented mythos entities. Traditional forbidden knowledge narratives, from Faust to Frankenstein, concern themselves with information that should not be known, because knowing it leads to moral corruption, divine punishment, or practical catastrophe. Lovecraft's treatment of major mythos entities sometimes follows this pattern. The cult of Cthulhu possesses dangerous knowledge that its members abuse through ritual and summoning, but knowledge of forgotten beings presents a different epistemological problem entirely. This is not knowledge that should not be accessed, but rather knowledge that cannot be accessed reliably, information that defeats the very mechanisms by which humans acquire, verify, and transmit understanding. The forbidden quality emerges not from external prohibition, but from internal impossibility. These entities resist being known, not because gods or cosmic forces have hidden them, but because human cognition lacks the architecture necessary to construct stable models of their nature. The forgetting is built into the structure of inquiry itself. The library of unread books stands as recurring motif in Lovecraft's exploration of epistemic limits, and nowhere does this motif function more powerfully than in references to texts containing information about forgotten beings. The Necronomicon occupies Miskatonic University's restricted collection, theoretically available to qualified scholars, but practically unread because most researchers lack the linguistic skills, historical context, and psychological fortitude necessary to engage the text meaningfully. But even those exceptional scholars who successfully navigate the Necronomicon's major contents find themselves defeated by its most fragmentary passages, the corrupted sections, the marginal annotations in unknown scripts, the references to entities whose names appear nowhere else in occult literature. These passages resist interpretation not because they are encrypted or written in lost languages, but because they describe things for which human conceptual vocabulary provides no equivalence. One might successfully translate every word and still fail to understand the sentence, just as one might observe every detail of a non-Euclidean angle and still fail to visualize its geometry. The forbidden texts concerning forgotten beings are thus doubly forbidden. First, by institutional restriction. Second, by cognitive impossibility. Archaeological sites present parallel problems at the physical level. Locations that should not be excavated because excavation itself proves futile or counterproductive. When Lovecraft's characters unearth cities built by the Elder Things or stumble upon Cthulhu's Pacific tomb, they at least encounter architecture that can be measured, artifacts that can be photographed, and inscriptions that might theoretically be translated. The sites associated with forgotten beings offer no such affordances. The caverns beneath Mount Vor-Mithridreth, where Abhoth spawns its progeny, possess geometries that surveying equipment cannot map reliably, producing measurements that contradict each other or violate spatial axioms. The angles through which the hounds of Tyndalos pursue their prey cannot be photographed because cameras capture curved light, not angular time. The ruins of Kenyan described in the mound contain chambers whose dimensions shift depending on the observer's state of consciousness. These sites do not simply hide information, but actively undermine the methodologies designed to extract it, suggesting that the problem lies not in our current technological limitations, but in the assumption that physical investigation can yield reliable data about phenomena that operate according to non-standard physics. The Necronomicon's fragmentary nature serves as thematic statement about the relationship between knowledge and preservation. Lovecraft specified that multiple editions existed: Arabic original, Greek translation, Latin translation, each with different passages preserved or lost, each introducing new translation errors while correcting old ones. No complete version survived. The best scholars could do was attempt synthesis across variant texts, noting where editions diverged and speculating about original meanings now irretrievable. This textual situation mirrors the actual state of many ancient religious documents, from the fragmentary pre-Socratic philosophers to the Dead Sea Scrolls with their missing sections and variant readings. But Lovecraft radicalized the implications. In his fictional universe, the fragmentation was not accident of historical preservation, but rather inevitable outcome of attempting to document entities that resist documentation. The passages about forgotten beings deteriorate fastest, as though the information itself possessed corrosive properties that attacked parchment and paper, or as though scribes unconsciously corrupted what they could not bear to copy accurately. Knowledge does not simply degrade through mechanical processes of decay, but through an active incompatibility between certain contents and their containers. Knowledge that dissolves itself presents perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated form of forgetting in Lovecraft's work. Certain concepts, once grasped, apparently cannot be retained by human memory. They exceed the mind's capacity to hold them, like water poured into a sieve. Characters in forgotten being narratives sometimes report having understood something crucial in the moment of encounter, possessed momentary clarity about the entity's nature or purpose, only to find this understanding evaporating as they attempt to articulate or record it. The knowledge was genuinely present, but proved too large, too dimensionally complex, or too alien to remain within the confines of neural architecture evolved for survival on Earth's surface. This suggests a hierarchy of information that parallels physical hierarchies, just as some objects are too massive to hold and some temperatures too extreme to withstand. Some knowledge may be too informationally dense or structurally complex to persist in human consciousness. The mind cannot help but simplify, compress, or discard, and in doing so, transforms accurate knowledge into inaccurate memory. The forgetting happens at the neurological level, making it impossible to overcome through discipline or technique. The ethical dimension of remembering versus forgetting receives surprisingly sophisticated treatment in the scattered narratives concerning forgotten beings. Is there moral obligation to preserve knowledge of these entities, to maintain humanity's awareness of them despite the dangers such awareness brings? Or does ethics demand precisely the opposite, that we should allow forgetting to continue, should perhaps actively suppress information about beings whose rediscovery threatens catastrophe? The cult guardians in some Lovecraft stories appear to take the latter position, maintaining rituals designed not to worship entities, but to keep them forgotten, to strengthen the barriers of ignorance that protect an unsuspecting humanity. This inverts the conventional wisdom that knowledge is intrinsically good and ignorance intrinsically dangerous. If some entities are genuinely hostile to human existence and can be counteracted only through collective amnesia, then forgetting becomes defensive necessity rather than regrettable failure. The ethical question becomes not how to remember, but how to forget more effectively, how to ensure that dangerous knowledge remains lost. Modern philosophical frameworks provide surprisingly useful tools for analyzing these fictional scenarios, particularly work in epistemology concerning testimony, evidence, and the social dimensions of knowledge. Philosophers like Miranda Fricker have explored how power structures determine which testimony gets believed and which gets dismissed as unreliable. Lovecraft's forgotten being narratives literalize these concerns. Characters who encounter such entities find their testimony systematically rejected, not through malicious conspiracy, but through reasonable skepticism about extraordinary claims lacking extraordinary evidence. The archaeologist who returns from Antarctica babbling about entities predating the elder things gets institutionalized. The translator who insists the Necronomicon references beings unknown to any other source gets dismissed as incompetent. Their testimony fails to generate knowledge at the social level, even when true at the individual level, and this failure ensures continued forgetting. The epistemological structures designed to filter false claims from true ones prove unable to accommodate truths that violate background assumptions, creating a systematic bias toward forgetting certain categories of knowledge, regardless of evidence quality. The ultimate implication approaches something like cosmic epistemological tragedy, the recognition that truth and knowledge may be genuinely incompatible for beings like us, that accuracy about certain aspects of reality requires cognitive capacities we do not and cannot possess, and that our ignorance is not temporary state, awaiting correction, but permanent limitation built into the structure of human consciousness. The forgotten beings remain forgotten not because we have failed to find adequate information sources, but because adequate information itself cannot be had, because the entity's nature exceeds what can be encoded in human-compatible formats, and because remembering would require becoming something other than human. This connects to Lovecraft's larger philosophical pessimism. We are not merely small in a vast cosmos, but cognitively trapped within the narrow band of reality that our particular evolutionary history has equipped us to perceive and process. The forgotten beings exist in regions of conceptual space that lie permanently outside this band, and every attempt to extend our reach toward them ends in failure, madness, or death. We are condemned not merely to ignorance, but to ignorance of our ignorance, unable even to catalog what we cannot know. The literary archaeology of forgotten beings requires tracing mentions across multiple authors and texts, examining how entities appeared, evolved, and sometimes vanished from the collaborative mythology Lovecraft and his circle constructed through their correspondence and published fiction. The earliest manifestations often emerge not in Lovecraft's own work, but in the contributions of Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and Frank Belknap Long, writers who shared Lovecraft's cosmic pessimism but brought distinct regional and aesthetic sensibilities to the shared project. Smith's Hyperborean cycle, set in a pre-human Arctic civilization, introduced entities that would become paradigmatic forgotten beings, Tsatogwa, Atlach-Nacha, and Abhoth among them. These beings possess the quality of deep antiquity even within Smith's already ancient setting, entities that the Hyperboreans themselves regarded as remnants from earlier epochs. The nested temporalities created vertiginous effect. Readers in the 1930s reading about civilizations millions of years past, who themselves worshipped gods from even earlier eras, generating an infinite regress of forgetting that stretched back toward the origins of terrestrial life itself. Frank Belknap Long's The Hounds of Tindalos, published in Weird Tales in March 1929, established the template for entities that exist outside conventional spatial and temporal frameworks. Long's protagonist, Halpin Chalmers, experiments with a drug called Liao that supposedly permits consciousness to travel through time. He reports encountering beings that inhabit angles rather than curves, entities that predate the universe's transition from angular to curved geometry, a transition Long places at some unspecified point in cosmic history. The hounds pursue Chalmers back to his present moment, hunting through the angles of the room's corners. Long describes them as having a tongue like a blue-white flame and long, ichor-dripping snouts, but he deliberately refrains from comprehensive physical description, leaving them fundamentally unvisualized. The story ends with Chalmers dead, his body mutilated, and the mystery of the hounds unresolved. This narrative structure, introduction of cosmologically significant entity, single dramatic encounter, protagonist's death, preventing further investigation, would become characteristic of forgotten being stories. Long never wrote a sequel, never expanded the hound's mythology, leaving them as isolated image in the larger mythos landscape. Clark Ashton Smith's The Seven Geeses, published in Weird Tales in October 1934, presents the most layered example of forgotten being mythology in the collaborative mythos. The story follows the sorcerer Ralabar Vuz through multiple episodes of exile and curse, each level driving him deeper beneath the earth until he reaches primordial caverns far below Mount Vormithadreth. In these depths, he encounters a succession of entities arranged in apparent hierarchy. The Vormis, degenerate proto-human cave dwellers; Tsathoggua, toad-like god worshipped by the Vormis; Adlach-Nacha, spider being older than Tsathoggua; and finally Abhoth, described as the source and father of all uncleanness. Each entity passes Vuz to the next with a Gies, a magical curse forcing him downward, until he becomes food for Abhoth's spawnings. The narrative structure creates a vertical cosmology of antiquity, with each level representing an earlier stratum of forgotten worship. Tsathoggua, who appears in multiple Smith and Lovecraft stories as relatively well-documented entity, here occupies merely middle position in hierarchy extending both above and below him. This relativizes even the known entities, suggesting that what seems ancient and terrible to surface dwellers is recent and trivial from the perspective of truly primordial powers. Robert E. Howard's contributions to forgotten being mythology emerged primarily through his non-Conan fiction, particularly stories set in Central Europe and featuring prehistoric survivals. The Black Stone, published in Weird Tales in November 1931, describes a monolith in Hungary commemorating worship of an entity never clearly named, associated with pre-human degenerates. Howard's descriptions emphasize the incompleteness of historical record. The story of the Black Stone is one that even the old legends of the countryside avoid, and whatever information has come down concerning it is disjointed and incoherent, like the memory of something desperately shut out of the mind. This meta-commentary on forgetting, built into the narrative itself, acknowledges that the text cannot provide comprehensive mythology because the mythology does not exist in comprehensive form. The entity worshipped at the stone has been forgotten so thoroughly that even its name survives only in corrupted form, perhaps as the Dark One, or perhaps something else entirely. The text refuses definitive answers. Lovecraft's own earliest contributions to the forgotten being tradition appear in stories predating his mature mythos construction. The Nameless City, written in January 1921, describes ancient reptilian civilization predating humanity by millions of years, the gods referenced but never specified. The story's famous couplet, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die," establishes the temporal framework necessary for forgotten beings, suggesting that entities can persist in states between existence and non-existence across geological epochs. The reptile things worshipped gods of their own, built temples to entities whose names the human narrator cannot discover, and possessed mythologies that vanished entirely when their civilization collapsed. The story operates primarily through absence. We see ruins, we intuit significance, but we never learn specifics. This technique of suggesting vast mythological depths while providing minimal detail would characterize Lovecraft's treatment of forgotten beings throughout his career. The interconnections between these texts created false impression of comprehensive shared universe, when in fact the consistency was largely illusory. Smith's Tsathoggua appears in Lovecraft's The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, but Lovecraft provides different details about the entity's nature and history than Smith did. Lovecraft mentions Howard's Children of the Night in several stories, but Howard's own references to these entities remain vague and inconsistent. The cross-references created authentication effect without actual systematization. Readers encountered the same names across different authors and contexts, suggesting these entities possessed objective reality independent of any single fictional treatment. Yet close examination reveals contradictions and gaps that undermine systematic interpretation. Was Tsathoggua worshipped in Hyperborea or imported there from Saturn? Did the hounds of Tyndallus hunt only time travelers or anyone who perceived angular time? The texts provide insufficient information to resolve these questions definitively. This inconsistency was feature rather than bug, generating the texture of real mythological traditions, where different sources always contradict each other, where names persist even after their meanings have been forgotten or transformed beyond recognition. The pattern of introduction without development dominated this early phase of mythos construction, particularly for forgotten beings. An entity would appear in one story, sometimes mentioned in a few others as passing reference, then vanish from the literary record. This created expanding roster of beings that collectively suggested vast cosmic hierarchy, extending far beyond what any individual story or author could document. Each new tell introduced 2 or 3 additional entities, referenced several more in passing, and implied dozens more through vague phrases like the spawn of the goat with 1,000 young, or servitors of entities whose names are forbidden. The cumulative effect across dozens of stories by multiple authors was atmosphere of overwhelming cosmic fecundity, reality teeming with non-human consciousnesses at every scale, from microscopic to galactic, most of them entirely unknown to humanity and likely to remain so. The forgotten beings were not exceptional cases, but rather representative samples, evidence that for every entity, human scholars had managed to document partially. Hundreds or thousands more existed in complete obscurity, their worship dead, their names lost, their very existence unknown, except to those unfortunate enough to stumble upon physical traces they had left behind eons ago. Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time, completed in 1935 and published posthumously in Astounding Stories in June 1936, represents perhaps his most sophisticated exploration of forgetting at cosmic scales, using amnesia as both psychological horror and metaphor for civilizational erasure. The story follows Nathaniel Peasley, a professor of economics at Miskatonic University, who experiences sudden personality change in 1908, spending 5 years in a dissociated state before abruptly recovering his original consciousness in 1913. During those missing years, he spoke of strange cities, ancient races, and incomprehensible technologies, but upon recovery, he claims complete amnesia for the period. The narrative structure mirrors the condition it explores. Peasley's personal forgetting becomes vehicle for examining entities that have been forgotten on geological timescales, and his eventual recovery of memory reveals not clarification, but deeper mysteries, forgotten beings that predate even the great race that temporarily inhabited his body. The story thus operates on multiple temporal registers simultaneously: individual human memory measured in years, great race history measured in millions of years, and older entities measured in timescales that render even the great race's vast span trivial. The great race of Yith, as Peasley gradually learns through recurring dreams and scholarly research, possess the ability to project their consciousness through time, swapping minds with beings from other epochs to escape catastrophe, threatening their own era. These entities, cone-shaped beings, with sensory apparatus at the summit and tentacles at the base, originated on some primordial planet but transferred to Earth approximately 600 million years ago when the original world faced destruction. They established vast cities in Australia's interior and built a civilization dedicated to accumulating knowledge from all ages, past and future. Their great library at Pennacotus supposedly contained mental projections and records from countless species across cosmic history. Yet even this unimaginably ancient and knowledgeable race feared something, possessed mythology about entities that predated them, and eventually fled Earth's present era for the distant future when some threat emerged that they could not control. The story carefully establishes the great race as nearly omniscient, possessing knowledge spanning hundreds of millions of years, only to reveal that even they have gaps in understanding, entities they cannot explain, forces they can only flee rather than comprehend. The flying polyps represent the primary forgotten entity in the narrative, though Lovecraft deliberately keeps them vague and horrifying through indirection rather than explicit description. These beings supposedly dominated Earth before the Great Race arrived, were driven underground through ancient war, and eventually resurged to drive the Great Race from their cities around 50 million years ago. Peasley's recovered memories and Australian expedition reveal traces of the polyps, their basalt towers without doors or windows, their whistling communications, their ability to become partly or wholly invisible. Lovecraft describes them through negative space and their effects rather than direct observation. Those half-plastic denizens of the hollow hills, those windless, windowless cylinders and pyramids, those sealed towers, those alien and forbidden crypts. The polyps exist in the narrative primarily as absence, as the thing that drove out even the great race, as force so terrible that beings with millions of years of accumulated knowledge chose temporal exile rather than continued confrontation. This establishes them as more fundamentally horrifying than the great race itself, yet the story provides almost no positive information about what they actually were beyond vague physical descriptions. The psychological dimension of the narrative hinges on memory's unreliability and the horror of recovered knowledge one wishes had remained forgotten. Peasley's 5 years of amnesia troubled him, certainly, but he had constructed comfortable life despite the gap, teaching again at Miskatonic and maintaining his family relationships. The dreams that begin years after his recovery disturbed this equilibrium, suggesting that what his conscious mind had forgotten remained preserved somewhere in his psyche, waiting to resurface. The dreams grow more detailed and compelling, eventually driving him to organize an archaeological expedition to Australia to verify whether the cities he remembers from his time as Yithian actually exist. The expedition succeeds in its immediate aim, discovering ruins matching Peasley's descriptions, but this validation proves Pyrrhic, confirming not merely that he experienced something real, but that he is connected to entities and histories he cannot escape. The climactic moment comes when Peasley discovers a book in the library at Pennacotus, written in his own handwriting from the future during a later body swap. This recursive loop suggests his entanglement with the great race is permanent, that he will be conscripted again, and that knowledge of this fact cannot be unknown. The narrative's treatment of the library at Pennacotus deserves particular attention as metaphor for cosmic scale archiving and its inevitable incompleteness. Lovecraft describes metal cases containing thought records from countless species across unimaginable time spans, records of every sort of experiment and observation which the members had made in other ages and worlds. The library supposedly contains complete histories of civilizations that arose and fell millions of years before humanity evolved, detailed knowledge of species now extinct, and projections of events billions of years in the future. Yet even this comprehensive archive has limitations. The great race could not project themselves into certain eras, possess no records from periods before their own origin, and evidently maintained only fragmentary understanding of the flying polyps, despite having warred against them. The greatest library in cosmic history remains fundamentally incomplete, suggesting that total knowledge is impossible, even for entities with time travel capabilities. Some eras remain inaccessible, some entities resist documentation, and even preserved records degrade or become incomprehensible as frames of reference shift across deep time. The story's ending reinforces forgetting as protective mechanism rather than mere failure. Peasley and his colleague Dyer discover the underground passage leading to the polyps' basalt towers, hear the characteristic whistling that signals their continued presence, and flee without attempting further investigation. They agree to suppress certain findings from their published expedition report, maintaining official silence about what they discovered in the deepest chambers. This deliberate choice to forget, to not record, to allow knowledge to die with them reflects recognition that some information genuinely should not be transmitted. Peasley writes his account as private document, depositing it in restricted archives where few will ever read it. And even this account withholds crucial details that might allow others to replicate his discoveries. The narrative thus ends with active forgetting, with the protagonist choosing amnesia over complete knowledge, suggesting that the human impulse toward comprehensive documentation must sometimes be resisted when encountering entities that predate or exceed safe comprehension. The shadow out of time operates simultaneously as psychological horror about personal amnesia and as cosmological horror about civilizational forgetting, using Peasley's individual memory loss as figure for the larger processes by which entire species and their gods vanish from cosmic record. The great race, for all their knowledge gathering and archival sophistication, will themselves eventually be forgotten, their cities eroded, their metal books corroded, their very existence reduced to fragmentary geological traces that future species may misinterpret or overlook entirely. The flying polyps, already barely remembered by the great race, will become even more obscure as time progresses. The pattern extends infinitely. Every present state contains forgotten pasts, and every present will itself be forgotten by incomprehensible futures. This temporal structure suggests that forgetting is not failure of record-keeping, but inevitable consequence of time itself, that the universe possesses no mechanism for permanent preservation, and that even the most determined attempts at comprehensive documentation must ultimately succumb to entropy. We are left with profound pessimism about knowledge and memory. Not only are we individually mortal and our civilizations temporary, but the very possibility of being remembered dissolves across sufficient temporal distance. The forgotten beings of the mythos become, in this context, our own future. We are all candidates for forgetting, separated from oblivion only by inadequate time. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness written in 1931 and published in Astounding Stories across February, March, and April 1936, presents the elder things as simultaneously the story's primary revelation and themselves carriers of mythology about even older, forgotten entities. The novella follows an Antarctic expedition from Miskatonic University that discovers perfectly preserved specimens of beings who dominated Earth hundreds of millions of years ago, creatures that created terrestrial life through biological engineering, but whose civilization eventually collapsed, and whose very existence was forgotten completely until this accidental excavation. The narrative strategy involves making the elder things themselves objects of archaeological investigation, while simultaneously revealing that they possess their own archaeology, their own records of predecessor entities, and their own catalogue of forgotten beings they feared or could not explain. This creates nested structure of forgetting. We discover beings who discovered other beings and who feared things they themselves had discovered in earlier strata. The elder. Things are both forgotten and rememberers of the forgotten, occupying intermediary position in cosmic history that emphasizes how forgetting operates at every temporal scale. The discovery proceeds through stages that mirror traditional archaeological revelation, though with implications that shatter conventional scientific frameworks. The expedition's first team, led by the unfortunate Lake, discovers a mountain range higher than the Himalayas and a cave system containing frozen elder thing specimens, along with evidence of their civilization, stone buildings, sculptures, and strange soapstone tablets covered with dot patterns suggesting written language. Lake's team radio reports express initial excitement at finding utterly novel biological specimens, then growing recognition that these beings possessed intelligence and culture, then finally frantic confusion as the specimens apparently revive. Lake's camp is destroyed, most personnel killed or mutilated, and several specimens disappear, along with crucial equipment and one of the expedition's dogs. The narrator, Professor Dyer, leads a second team to investigate and discovers Lake's camp in ruins, with bizarre details suggesting the specimens had indeed revived, examined their discoverers with scientific curiosity, and departed toward the mountain range's interior. This establishes the elder things as active agents in the narrative rather than mere fossil discoveries, but also as comprehensible enough to show curiosity and scientific method, making them intermediate between humanity and the truly alien entities the story will reveal. The mountain city that Dyer and his graduate student Danforth discover beyond Lake's camp provides the novella's primary archaeological record, a vast ruined metropolis built on megalithic scale, with architecture incorporating both familiar geometric forms and disturbing aberrations. Lovecraft devotes substantial narrative space to describing the city's layout, the size and construction of its buildings, and especially the extensive bas-relief carvings that cover interior walls, depicting the elder thing's history across hundreds of millions of years. These murals function as visual text, a form of prehistoric history book that Dyer can partially interpret despite the alien aesthetic. The carvings show the elder thing's arrival on Earth approximately 1 billion years ago, the creation of life forms, including the Shoggoths, protoplasmic servitor beings, their wars with other spacefaring entities, including the Starspawn of Cthulhu and the Migo, their eventual decline as Shoggoths gained intelligence and revolted, and their final retreat to the Antarctic city as climate changed and their global civilization fragmented. The murals provide mythology as visual narrative, but crucially, they also contain gaps, damaged sections, and passages that Dyer admits he cannot interpret, leaving mysteries even within this comprehensive historical record. The Shoggoths represent the primary forgotten entity within, at the Mountains of Madness. Though their status as forgotten is paradoxical, they were created by the Elder Things as biological tools, rebelled to achieve independence, and apparently still exist in the deep caverns beneath the city. The murals depict their evolution from mindless protoplasm to increasingly complex and intelligent beings that eventually developed the capacity to mimic their masters' forms and perhaps even their thought processes. The Elder Things' final murals show desperate battles against Shoggoth rebellions, the establishment of new controls, the periodic breakdowns of those controls. The narrative suggests the Shoggoths are what destroyed Lake's camp and what pursued the revived Elder Things into the depths, making them active threat in the story's present. Yet despite their prominence in the Elder Things' history, Shoggoths have been completely forgotten by surface dwellers. No human mythology references them, no occult tradition warns of them, and their existence would have remained unknown if not for this expedition's discoveries. They represent forgotten beings of peculiar type, not primordial entities from before terrestrial life, but rather artificially created beings whose creators have been forgotten, orphaning them from any historical context. The story's climax involves Dyer and Danforth's pursuit of the Elder Thing specimens through underground passages, eventually discovering evidence that the specimens were killed and partially consumed by Shoggoths. The encounter with an actual living Shoggoth, described only through Danforth's mad ravings after the fact and through Dyer's careful circumlocutions, represents the narrative's point of maximum horror. Lovecraft describes it as a nightmare plastic column of fetid black iridescence, producing sounds rendered as tekeli-li, tekeli-li, the same cry the Elder Things made. The creature's ability to mimic its creator's language, combined with its formlessness and its clear hostility, suggests it has evolved far beyond its original servitor function into something approaching autonomous intelligence. Yet this intelligence lacks cultural framework. The Shoggoths have no civilization, no art, no mythology of their own. They exist in evolutionary limbo, too intelligent to be mere animals, but lacking the social structures that transform intelligence into culture. This makes them perhaps the most thoroughly forgotten beings in the mythos. Not only has human civilization never known them, but they themselves possess no tradition, no memory beyond what their presumably simple nervous systems can retain. They are forgotten and cannot remember. The murals contain references to entities beyond even the Elder Things' comprehensive history, beings depicted in damaged or deliberately obscured sections that Dyer cannot fully interpret. He mentions seeing images of what might be the flying polyps mentioned in The Shadow Out of Time, suggestions of conflicts with entities arriving from other dimensions or remote cosmic locations, and cryptic symbols he suspects represent beings too terrible for the Elder Things to depict clearly. These fragmentary references establish the Elder Things' own archaeology, their own investigations of predecessor civilizations and contemporary rivals. Despite possessing millions of years of recorded history and presumably advanced science, they encountered phenomena they could not explain or forces they chose not to document fully. The damaged condition of some mural sequences might reflect simple erosion, but Dyer suspects deliberate defacement, as though certain subjects were too dangerous to preserve visually. This suggests that the elder things themselves practiced selective forgetting, that they chose to allow certain knowledge to erode rather than maintaining comprehensive records of everything they encountered. Danforth's final breakdown, triggered by something he glimpsed during their escape, introduces the story's ultimate forgotten entity, something so terrible that the narrative refuses to name or describe it, even obliquely. Dyer reports only that Danforth, during their flight over the mountains, looked back toward the city and saw something that shattered his sanity. Danforth's ravings afterward mix references to Yog-Sothoth, Tsathoggua, and other Mythos entities, suggesting he either saw something that resembled these beings, or that his mind, breaking down, reached for whatever mythological framework it possessed to categorize the uncategorizable. The narrative ends with Dyer pleading that future Antarctic expeditions be cancelled, that the mountains and their secrets be left undisturbed, that what he and Danforth discovered should be forgotten rather than investigated further. This plea for institutional forgetting, for deliberate suppression of knowledge, represents Lovecraft's most explicit endorsement of protective amnesia. Some things, the story argues, were forgotten for good reason, and scholarship's reflexive impulse toward complete documentation should be resisted when encountering entities that predate or exceed safe human comprehension. At the Mountains of Madness establishes the template for nested archaeology, the discovery of one forgotten civilization's records of even older forgotten entities that subsequent weird fiction would adopt and extend. The elder things occupy precisely the position that makes them most effective as forgotten beings, ancient enough to be genuinely alien and terrifying, yet recent enough to have left extensive material record, and themselves possessing traditions about things older and more alien still. They demonstrate that forgetting operates fractally at every level of cosmic history, and that even beings with hundreds of millions of years of accumulated knowledge cannot escape the eventual erasure that time imposes on all consciousness and all civilizations. The story's pessimism extends beyond humanity to encompass all possible intelligences. We are not uniquely fragile or unfortunate in our tendency toward forgetting, but rather experiencing the universal condition of temporal beings in an entropic universe. The elder things will be forgotten as thoroughly as they themselves forgot their own predecessors, and whatever entities succeed, humanity will likely remain unaware that we ever existed, just as we would have remained ignorant of the elder things, if not for impossible coincidence of their perfect preservation and our Antarctic expedition. The mountains contain secrets, certainly, but the deeper revelation is that all mountains contain secrets. All geological strata hide forgotten civilizations, and the apparent solidity of Earth's surface conceals temporal depths where knowledge goes to die. The posthumous systematization of Lovecraft's mythos began almost immediately after his death in 1937, spearheaded primarily by August Derleth, who positioned himself as literary executor and guardian of the Lovecraftian tradition. Derleth's approach to the mythos diverged fundamentally from Lovecraft's own practice, replacing cosmic indifference with cosmic conflict, transforming suggestive fragments into comprehensive taxonomies, an imposing theological structure onto material that had resisted such organization. His posthumous collaborations, stories based on Lovecraft's fragmentary notes or story ideas, frequently elevated forgotten beings to central positions, providing them with elaborate backstories, clear motivations, and definitive relationships to other entities. Where Lovecraft had mentioned Hastur in passing as a location or entity, Derleth developed it into a major opposing deity. Where Lovecraft had referenced Ithaqua obliquely, Derleth created extensive mythology about the Windwalker. This transformation represented fundamental misunderstanding of what made Lovecraft's forgotten beings effective. Their power resided in incompleteness, and completing them eliminated the philosophical uncertainty that generated horror. Derleth's systematization made the mythos more accessible to subsequent writers and more amenable to role-playing game adaptation, but it sacrificed the epistemological anxiety that had made Lovecraft's original vision disturbing. The Derleth systematization centered on his dualistic cosmology, dividing entities into elder gods, benevolent or at least neutral, and great old ones, malevolent and imprisoned. This structure borrowed from Zoroastrian and Christian dualism, imposing good versus evil framework onto mythology that Lovecraft had deliberately constructed as amoral. Derleth associated entities with classical elements, Cthulhu with water, Hastur with air, Shudamel with earth, creating organizational scheme that made mythos entities comprehensible through familiar occult correspondences. This elemental mapping had no basis in Lovecraft's original texts, but proved enormously influential on subsequent mythos, fiction, and games. The forgotten beings particularly suffered from this treatment because their vagueness and lack of clear associations became problems to solve rather than features to preserve. Derleth's stories typically explained what Lovecraft had left mysterious, provided origins where Lovecraft had suggested only effects, and made explicit what Lovecraft had communicated through implication. The result was mythos that functioned more like conventional fantasy pantheon, comprehensible, categorizable, and ultimately less disturbing because readers could map it onto familiar theological structures. Lynn Carter's additions to the mythos in the 1970s continued and expanded Derleth's systematizing impulse, though with more attention to creating internally consistent chronologies and mythological relationships. Carter's Zothic legend cycle attempted to provide comprehensive prehistory, connecting various mythos entities, explaining their origins, their interrelationships, and their ultimate fates. He elevated minor entities from Lovecraft's work, Zothic, Zoth Omug, Gatanothoa, giving them extensive mythologies and connecting them through complex genealogies. Carter's fiction reads more like fantasy world-building than cosmic horror, complete with detailed timelines of cosmic events, maps of non-Euclidean cities, and taxonomies of entity types. This approach found enthusiastic audience among readers who wanted comprehensive reference materials, but fundamentally altered the nature of the mythos. The forgotten beings became merely lesser known rather than genuinely forgotten. Their obscurity transformed from thematic statement about epistemological limits into mere lack of reader familiarity. Carter compiled concordances, glossaries, and encyclopedic references that made the mythos navigable, but eliminated the productive disorientation that Lovecraft's original incompleteness had generated. Ramsey Campbell represents a different approach to mythos expansion, one that retained Lovecraft's philosophical pessimism while transplanting cosmic horror to new geographical and cultural contexts. Campbell's British mythos fiction, beginning with stories collected in The Inhabitant of the Lake, 1964, introduced new entities like Glaki and Ihort that functioned as regional variants of Lovecraft's cosmic horrors. These beings possessed the quality of forgotten entities. Campbell provided enough detail to make them viscerally disturbing, but resisted comprehensive explanation of their origins or ultimate nature. His story, The Inhabitant of the Lake, describes a being that supposedly arrived in meteor impact and now inhabits an English lake, transforming those who serve it into undead slaves. But Campbell never clarifies whether Glaki possesses intelligence, whether its transformative effect is deliberate or automatic, or what relationship it bears to other mythos entities. This restraint preserved something of Lovecraft's original approach. Entities remain fundamentally mysterious despite providing concrete horror through their effects on human victims. Campbell understood that forgetting operates through withholding rather than through obscuring, that one creates effective forgotten beings not by describing them through purple prose, but by refusing to describe them comprehensively at all. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series, 1971-1989, took opposite approach, providing extensive elaboration of mythos cosmology, including detailed explanations of entity biology, psychology, and metaphysics. Lumley's fiction reads as cosmic horror transformed into science fiction, with the supernatural explained through alternate dimensions, alien biology, and psychic powers. His treatment of the forgotten beings involved retrieving them from obscurity and making them central to elaborate plots. The Hounds of Tyndalos receive extensive treatment, their nature and origin fully specified. The Flying Polyps become tactical opponents with comprehensible motivations and capabilities. This approach satisfied readers desiring adventure fiction set in Lovecraft's universe, but abandoned the philosophical core of cosmic horror, the recognition that some things resist human categorization and comprehension. Lumley's mythos is ultimately comfortable despite its surface horrors, because readers can understand it, can map its entities and their relationships, and can feel confidence that human characters might successfully oppose or even defeat cosmic forces. The forgotten have been remembered too successfully, domesticated through explanation. The role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, first published by Chaosium in 1981, represented perhaps the most significant popularization and systematization of the mythos for late 20th century audiences. The game required quantification. Entities needed statistics, abilities, and clear parameters so players could interact with them mechanically. This necessitated resolving the ambiguities and incompleteness that characterized Lovecraft's forgotten beings. The game supplements provided comprehensive entries for entities that appeared in only single sentences in the original fiction, invented complete mythologies where Lovecraft had provided only suggestions, and created consistent rules for how various beings interacted with each other and with human worshippers. This transformation from literature to game inevitably altered the mythos's nature, making it more systematic but less philosophically disturbing. Players could look up any entity in the rulebook, learn its capabilities and weaknesses, and prepare appropriate strategies. The forgotten beings became stat blocks, their mystery reduced to numerical values and mechanical effects. This proves particularly poignant when examining how the game handled entities like Abhotha or Atlak Nacha, Beings that Lovecraft and Smith had deliberately left underdeveloped received full game statistics, ecological niches, and motivational frameworks that made them legible within game mechanics, but eliminated their essential unknowability. Contemporary weird fiction has produced more sophisticated engagements with the concept of forgotten beings, particularly from writers associated with the new weird movement. Laird Barron's stories frequently feature entities like Old Leech and the Black Guide that function as regional cosmic horrors tied to specific American landscapes. Barron's approach combines Lovecraftian cosmic pessimism with noir aesthetics and literary modernism, creating fiction that acknowledges the mythos tradition while refusing simple replication. His forgotten beings remain genuinely disturbing because he resists explanation even when providing extensive concrete detail about their effects and their human servants. Similarly, Thomas Ligotti's philosophical horror fiction, while not explicitly mythos-based, explores themes of cosmic erasure and ontological uncertainty that extend Lovecraft's core insights. Ligotti's entities, when they appear at all, exist as absences, as distortions in reality's fabric, rather than as concrete beings that could be described or categorized. This represents evolution of the forgotten being concept into pure philosophical abstraction. Horror derived not from encountering unknown entities, but from recognizing that the categories of known and unknown themselves may be inadequate for describing reality. The contemporary mythos faces peculiar problem regarding forgotten beings. Comprehensive wikis, fan databases, and online communities have documented every entity mentioned in mythos fiction, however briefly. The Cthulhu Mythos Wiki contains entries for beings that appeared in single sentences, providing plot summaries, cross-references, and interpretive speculation. This crowdsourced scholarship has made it nearly impossible for any mythos entity to remain genuinely forgotten. Fans immediately incorporate new creations into existing taxonomies, speculatively connect them to established entities, and develop elaborate theories about their nature and origins. This represents the ultimate victory of systematization over mystery, the triumph of comprehensive documentation over productive ignorance. Yet perhaps this development itself becomes appropriate to Lovecraft's pessimistic vision. We cannot help but attempt to know, to categorize, to map everything we encounter, even when the act of knowing destroys what made the thing worth knowing. The contemporary mythos, community's determination to document every forgotten being, recapitulates humanity's doomed project of comprehensive knowledge, demonstrating that we will catalog our way to enlightenment, even if enlightenment proves to be merely another word for the elimination of productive mystery. The trajectory from Lovecraft's strategic incompleteness through Derleth's systematization to contemporary hyper-documentation reveals changing cultural relationship to mystery and knowledge. Lovecraft wrote during an era that still valued certain forms of obscurity, that accepted gaps in knowledge as inevitable and perhaps desirable. Subsequent decades witnessed accelerating commitment to comprehensive information, the sense that all mysteries could and should be solved through sufficient investigation. The forgotten beings of the mythos have largely been remembered, their obscurity eliminated through decades of creative expansion and fan scholarship. Yet in this very process, something essential has been lost: the recognition that not everything should be known, that some mysteries serve important psychological and philosophical functions, and that the universe may contain aspects genuinely resistant to human comprehension, regardless of how much information we accumulate. The current mythos, with its extensive documentation and elaborate taxonomies, may be more accessible, but is certainly less disturbing than Lovecraft's original vision of entities that appeared once and vanished, leaving only the uncomfortable certainty that we had glimpsed something we could never fully understand or successfully forget. The boundary between Lovecraft's fictional forgotten beings and actual folklore began eroding almost immediately upon the Mythos' publication, as readers unfamiliar with weird fiction encountered references to the Necronomicon or entities like Cthulhu and assumed they represented genuine occult traditions. This confusion intensified throughout the latter 20th century, producing deliberate hoaxes, sincere misunderstandings, and a peculiar category of cultural production where participants maintained ambiguous relationships to literal belief. The 1977 publication of the Simon Necronomicon, marketed as translation of genuine ancient grimoire, represents the most commercially successful exploitation of this confusion. The book combined Sumerian deity names, Lovecraftian terminology, and ceremonial magic rituals into syncretic text that many purchasers apparently believed to be authentic historical document rather than modern invention trading on Lovecraft's fictional authority. The Simon Necronomicon has remained continuously in print for nearly 5 decades, suggesting substantial audience either convinced of its authenticity or willing to suspend disbelief sufficiently to incorporate its rituals into actual occult practice. This represents remarkable achievement in false authentication, a text explicitly based on fictional source successfully presenting itself as the fictional source's historical original. The internet age dramatically accelerated the mythology-making process, allowing forgotten beings to acquire pseudo-historical documentation at unprecedented speed and scale. Websites devoted to Lovecraftian entities began appearing in the mid-1990s, many deliberately blurring the line between fiction and supposed reality through presentation formats, mimicking academic or archaeological resources. These sites frequently included fabricated historical references, photoshopped images of artifacts, and testimonial accounts from individuals claiming encounters with mythos entities. The aesthetic of digital decay, corrupted images, broken links, mysterious server errors, reinforced the impression that certain knowledge was being actively suppressed, or that the information itself possessed dangerous properties that degraded its containers. This strategy exploited the internet's inherent unreliability during its early decades, when distinguishing authentic from fabricated sources proved genuinely difficult for casual users. The forgotten beings benefited particularly from this environment because their canonical obscurity made them plausible candidates for hidden knowledge that mainstream sources overlooked or suppressed. If you had never heard of Atlach-Nacha, was that because it was fictional or because its reality had been successfully concealed? Urban legends concerning archaeological suppression provide another vector through which forgotten beings infiltrate consensus reality, or at least consensus unreality. Online communities devoted to conspiracy theories frequently reference Lovecraftian entities when discussing allegedly suppressed discoveries, Antarctic expeditions that found ruins matching Lovecraft's descriptions, deep-sea explorations that encountered structures suggesting R'lyeh's existence, or classified military projects investigating dimensional gates. These narratives typically claim that governmental or academic institutions have discovered evidence of pre-human civilizations or non-terrestrial entities, but suppress this information to prevent public panic. The forgotten beings fit perfectly into this conspiracy framework because their fictional obscurity can be reinterpreted as evidence of successful suppression. The argument becomes circular and self-reinforcing. If these entities were real, authorities would naturally suppress evidence of them. And the lack of mainstream acknowledgement proves not their fictionality, but rather the effectiveness of the suppression. This logic immunizes the claims against falsification while providing adherents with satisfying explanation for why their esoteric knowledge remains esoteric. The phenomenon of cryptid sightings provides concrete manifestation of this fictional to folklore pipeline, with various anomalous creature reports retrospectively associated with Lovecraftian entities. The Dover demon, sighted in Massachusetts in 1977, has been interpreted by some enthusiasts as possible Shoggoth or servitor of forgotten gods. The Flatwoods monster, reported in West Virginia in 1952, has been speculatively connected to Mythos entities despite predating widespread knowledge of Lovecraft's work. These retroactive connections demonstrate how Lovecraft's fictional framework has become sufficiently culturally embedded to serve as interpretive lens for anomalous experiences. When individuals encounter something they cannot immediately categorize, whether actual phenomenon, misperceived natural occurrence, or hallucination, Lovecraftian entities now exist as available explanatory option alongside aliens, interdimensional travelers, or unknown animals. The forgotten beings particularly lend themselves to this appropriation because their incompletely documented nature allows flexible interpretation. Any strange sighting can potentially be the hounds of Tyndalos or the spawn of Abhoth. The lack of canonical definitiveness becomes advantage rather than limitation. Occult subcultures have engaged with Lovecraftian entities in ways that transcend simple role-playing or ironic appropriation, incorporating them into actual magical practice with varying degrees of literal belief. Chaos magic, a tradition emerging in the 1970s emphasizing results over dogma and treating belief itself as tool rather than commitment, adopted mythos entities as servitors and egregores, thought forms that magicians could invoke regardless of their ontological status. Peter Carroll's Liber Null and other chaos magic texts explicitly reference Lovecraftian beings, arguing that fictional entities possess magical efficacy equal to traditionally recognized spirits or demons. This pragmatic approach sidesteps questions of literal existence. Whether Nyarlathotep is real matters less than whether invoking Nyarlathotep produces desired psychological or material effects. The forgotten beings prove particularly useful within this framework because their incomplete mythologies allow practitioners to develop personalized relationships unencumbered by extensive traditional associations. Invoking a thoroughly documented demon like Asmodeus carries centuries of accumulated interpretive baggage. Invoking Atlach Nacha allows practitioner to construct meaning through direct experience rather than inherited tradition. The phenomenon of creepypasta and internet horror fiction has produced new category of forgotten beings that exist in quantum superposition between acknowledged fiction and cultivated uncertainty. The SCP Foundation collaborative fiction project, beginning around 2008, created extensive documentation of anomalous entities and objects, many explicitly inspired by Lovecraftian concepts. The SCP-055 entry describes an anti-memetic entity, a being that erases memory of itself from those who encounter it, making documentation nearly impossible. This concept represents sophisticated evolution of Lovecraft's forgotten beings, entities whose nature includes active resistance to being known or remembered. The SCP Foundation fiction maintains elaborate verisimilitude through bureaucratic language, clinical documentation, and cross-referenced entries, creating effect similar to Lovecraft's false authentication, but scaled to collaborative wiki format involving hundreds of writers. The project has spawned actual anti-memetics research within the fiction community, writers exploring how entities could theoretically operate if they possessed properties that defeated perception and memory. This represents forgotten beings taken to logical extreme. What if certain entities actively maintain their forgotten status through mechanisms that prevent documentation? These various manifestations of forgotten beings in contemporary mythology and hoax culture reveal enduring human fascination with hidden knowledge and suppressed history. The entities persist, not despite their fictional origins, but because their fictionality allows safe engagement with concepts that would be genuinely disturbing if believed literally. We can explore the philosophical implications of beings that resist knowledge, can construct elaborate mythologies around entities that exist in documentation gaps, and can experience the frisson of cosmic horror while maintaining ultimate security that these are stories rather than realities. Yet the boundary remains productively ambiguous for many participants, creating space where serious philosophical investigation and playful creative construction coexist. The forgotten beings of the contemporary internet age demonstrate how Lovecraft's original strategy of false authentication has been adopted and adapted by communities that understand they are creating mythology, but engage with sufficient seriousness that the creation feels, at least temporarily, like discovery. We are all archaeologists of imaginary civilizations now, documenting with scholarly rigor entities we know are invented but treat as though they might, possibly, somehow, be real. The cinematic adaptation of Lovecraft's forgotten beings presents fundamental challenge: how to visualize entities that derive their horror from remaining partially unvisualized, how to show what should remain suggested, how to make concrete what functions best as implication. Early Lovecraft film adaptations largely avoided this problem by focusing on more comprehensible elements: cultists, forbidden books, human madness, while keeping cosmic entities off-screen or obscured. Roger Corman's The Haunted Palace, 1963, ostensibly based on Poe, but incorporating substantial Lovecraft elements, shows cultists and mutations, but never clearly depicts the entity they worship. This restraint, whether born from budgetary limitations or aesthetic judgment, actually served the material well, maintaining the suggestive horror that makes forgotten beings effective. Later films with larger budgets often violated this principle, providing detailed creature effects that transformed cosmic unknowability into rubber-suited monsters. The fundamental problem persists. Forgotten beings function literarily through epistemological uncertainty, through the gap between what characters encounter and what they can articulate. But film is medium of showing, of making visible what literature could leave implicit. The Void, a 2016 Canadian horror film directed by Stephen Kostansky and Jeremy Gillespie, represents one of the more successful recent attempts to translate forgotten being aesthetics to cinema. The film centers on a small-town hospital that becomes nexus for cult attempting to transcend mortality through transformation into something post-human. The entities that emerge from this process, the transformed, resist easy categorization, their forms combining human anatomy with impossible geometries and biological structures that seem to violate physical laws. The filmmakers use primarily practical effects rather than CGI, creating creatures with tangible presence and texture that feel genuinely alien rather than digitally rendered. More importantly, the film resists explaining these beings comprehensively, offering fragmentary mythology through cultist dialogue and horrified reactions, but never providing definitive taxonomy or origin story. The final revelation shows protagonist glimpsing a dimension of vast triangular void containing entities at scales that dwarf human comprehension, but the film cuts away before providing clear view, maintaining productive uncertainty about what exactly he witnessed. This restraint in an era of digital effects that could show anything demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how Lovecraftian horror operates. Video games provide different adaptive possibilities, offering interactivity and player agency that can transform passive observation into active investigation, though this too presents complications. Bloodborne, a 2015 action role-playing game by From Software, demonstrates how forgotten beings can function in interactive medium while maintaining their essential mysteriousness. The game initially presents as Victorian Gothic horror with werewolves and hunters, but Midpoint Revelation transforms it into cosmic horror as players discover that the city of Yharnam was built atop ruins containing Great Ones, entities from dimensions beyond human comprehension seeking to transcend their alien existence through reproducing with humans. The Great Ones are depicted but never explained. Players encounter them as boss battles without receiving comprehensive lore about their origins, motivations, or nature. The game scatters cryptic item descriptions, environmental storytelling, and fragmentary NPC dialogue that suggests mythology without providing complete picture. Players who seek comprehensive understanding must engage in wiki-based collaboration, assembling fragmentary evidence into tentative interpretations that remain speculative rather than definitive. This successfully replicates Lovecraft's original strategy, providing enough information to generate fascination while withholding enough to maintain mystery. Darkest Dungeon, a 2016 roguelike dungeon crawler, takes different approach to interactive Lovecraftian horror, focusing on psychological degradation rather than direct cosmic revelation. The game's mechanics systematically break down player characters' sanity through accumulating stress, eventually causing mental afflictions that alter their behavior and capabilities. The forgotten beings in Darkest Dungeon appear primarily as the heart of darkness in the game's final dungeon, a cosmic entity whose nature remains deliberately ambiguous. Is it alien god, dimensional parasite, or manifestation of some more abstract cosmic principle? The game refuses definitive answer, providing only the ancestor's fragmentary narration describing his obsessive excavation beneath his estate and what he discovered there. The genius of the adaptation lies in making the mechanical systems, stress, affliction, mortality, embody the philosophical content. Players experience cognitive breakdown not as cutscene, but as degradation of their tactical capabilities, making Lovecraft's concept of sanity-shattering revelation into lived gameplay experience rather than merely narrated event. Tabletop role-playing games face the unique challenge of quantifying entities that resist quantification, assigning statistics and mechanics to beings whose horror derives from exceeding human comprehension. Call of Cthulhu, the longest-running Lovecraftian RPG, attempts to solve this through sanity mechanics that make encountering entities costly regardless of their combat statistics. Forgotten beings in Call of Cthulhu typically receive minimal stat blocks precisely because they should not be defeated through conventional means. Their function is to be glimpsed, to traumatize, and to escape before players can engage them tactically. Recent editions have emphasized this through rules, encouraging game masters to keep entity descriptions vague, to provide contradictory information from different sources, and to never allow complete knowledge. This represents sophisticated metagaming. The rulebook acknowledges it must provide some mechanical framework, but actively encourages users to subvert that framework's completeness. The most effective Call of Cthulhu scenarios concerning forgotten beings end not with entities defeated, but with investigators choosing to stop investigating, to walk away from knowledge that cannot benefit them, to accept permanent ignorance as victory condition. Musical adaptations of Lovecraftian themes demonstrate how audio can evoke forgotten beings without visual representation, working through atmosphere and implication rather than concrete depiction. Portal and Cure, Australian death metal band, released Ion in 2018, an album that uses extreme dissonance, atonal structures, and deliberately degraded production quality to create sonic analog of cosmic horror. The music resists conventional song structure, avoiding clear melodic development or rhythmic predictability, creating audio experience that feels actively hostile to human listening preferences. This mirrors how forgotten beings resist human comprehension. The music is not simply difficult, but seems organized according to principles incompatible with how human auditory processing expects sound to behave. The Cryochamber label specializes in dark ambient music explicitly inspired by Lovecraft, releasing albums with titles like Cthulhu and Azathoth that use field recordings, processed sounds, and minimal melodic content to evoke vast empty spaces and alien presences. These albums function as audio archaeology, creating soundscapes that suggest what pre-human or non-human spaces might sound like. The absence of conventional musical elements, melody, rhythm, harmonic progression, becomes the point, creating negative space where listeners project their own imaginative horrors. The persistent challenge across all adaptive media remains the same: how to be true to material whose essential quality is in completeness, how to show beings that should not be shown, how to make audience experience the epistemological breakdown that characterizes encounters with forgotten entities. The most successful adaptations understand that this requires not simply depicting scary monsters, but rather creating formal strategies, narrative fragmentation, mechanical degradation, audio incoherence, that make the medium itself seem to break down under the weight of what it attempts to represent. When film glitches, when game mechanics fail, when music resists listenability, the adaptation approaches the condition of Lovecraft's prose, language straining to describe what language cannot accommodate. The forgotten beings remain most effective when the media translating them acknowledge their own inadequacy to the task, when the adaptation performs its own epistemic collapse rather than confidently presenting comprehensive vision. This explains why low-budget films with technical limitations often succeed where expensive productions fail. The The visible inadequacy of the medium paradoxically serves the material better than polished digital perfection that can show anything and thereby shows too much. The forgotten should remain forgotten, even in adaptation, present only as absence, documented only through their effects on the medium, attempting to document them. The academic legitimization of Lovecraft studies, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the early 21st century, transformed cosmic horror from pulp marginalia into subject of serious scholarly investigation, producing conferences, peer-reviewed journals, and university courses devoted to weird fiction and its philosophical implications. This institutional recognition occurred alongside broader acceptance of popular culture as worthy object of academic analysis, but Lovecraft's work proved particularly amenable to scholarly treatment because it engaged explicitly with epistemological questions, scientific materialism, and the philosophy of consciousness. The forgotten beings of the mythos became focal points for discussions about representation's limits, about what can and cannot be known, and about how narrative accommodates or fails to accommodate radical alterity. Scholars from philosophy, literary theory, and cultural studies discovered in Lovecraft's fragmentary mythologies a rich text for exploring questions about knowledge, memory, and the construction of coherent worldviews in the face of information that resists integration. The academic appropriation has been largely respectful, but has also domesticated the material, transforming horror into hermeneutics and cosmic dread into theoretical discourse. The new weird literary movement, theorized primarily through the work of China Miéville and championed by editors like Anne and Jeff Vandermeer, positioned itself as heir to Lovecraft's innovations while rejecting his reactionary politics and some of his aesthetic limitations. New weird writers like Miéville, Laird Barron, and Caitlin R. Kiernan appropriated forgotten being aesthetics, entities that resist categorization, mythologies that remain incomplete, cosmologies that exceed human comprehension, while expanding the approach to include urban settings, working-class protagonists, and explicit engagement with contemporary social issues. Miéville's novel, Perdido Street Station, features the slake moths, creatures that feed on consciousness itself, and cannot be looked at directly without triggering hallucinogenic terror, functioning as updated version of forgotten beings for postmodern context. The new weird demonstrated that Lovecraft's formal innovations, his strategies for representing the unrepresentable, could be separated from his specific content and worldview, that forgotten beings need not serve cosmic pessimism exclusively, but could interrogate capitalism, colonialism, and other systems that render populations invisible or expendable. This represents productive appropriation, taking Lovecraft's techniques while rejecting his limitations. Philosophical appropriation of Lovecraftian themes intensified through the work of theorists like Eugene Thacker, whose trilogy, In the Dust of This Planet, Starry Speculative Corpse, and Tentacles Longer Than Night, explicitly mobilizes cosmic horror as philosophical methodology. Thacker argues that horror fiction provides unique resources for thinking about what he calls the world without us, reality, as it exists independent of human perception or concern. Lovecraft's forgotten beings become exemplary figures for this philosophy because they embody radical indifference to human categories and human survival. Thacker's work sits at the boundary between academic philosophy and cultural criticism, written in accessible prose but engaging seriously with figures from medieval mysticism to contemporary continental philosophy. His appropriation of Lovecraft treats cosmic horror not as entertainment, but as mode of thought, way of approaching questions about existence, consciousness, and meaning that conventional philosophy's humanistic assumptions cannot adequately address. This represents, perhaps, the most sophisticated academic engagement with the material, taking Lovecraft's philosophical implications seriously while avoiding both credulous literalism and dismissive condescension. Mark Fisher's concept of the weird and the eerie, developed in his posthumously published book, The Weird and the Eerie, provides another framework for academic appropriation of Lovecraftian themes. Fisher distinguishes between the weird, the presence of something that should not be, and the eerie, the absence of something that should be present. Forgotten beings occupy both categories simultaneously. They are weird in their alien presence, but eerie in their incompleteness, in the gaps where mythology should exist, but doesn't. Fisher's work connected these aesthetic categories to broader cultural and political analysis, arguing that weird fiction's epistemological disruptions parallel the disorientation of late capitalism, where familiar structures collapse and new configurations emerge without clear causality or logic. His reading of Lovecraft emphasized how cosmic horror articulates specifically modern anxieties about knowledge, agency, and the limits of human significance in systems, whether cosmic or economic, that exceed individual or even collective comprehension. This political appropriation treats forgotten beings as allegorical figures for invisible forces, financial flows, algorithmic systems, ecological catastrophes that shape human existence while remaining largely imperceptible to those they affect. The Lovecraft Country phenomenon represents a different kind of appropriation, one that maintains Lovecraftian aesthetic while explicitly interrogating and rejecting his racism. Matt Ruff's 2016 novel Lovecraft Country and the subsequent 2020 HBO television adaptation place African American protagonists in 1950s America, encountering both cosmic horrors and the very real horrors of Jim Crow, segregation, and white supremacy. The series uses Lovecraftian imagery, tentacled entities, dimensional gates, forbidden rituals, to explore how American racism functions as its own kind of cosmic horror for those subjected to it, an irrational and overwhelming force that treats Black lives as insignificant. The forgotten beings in this context become metaphors for forgotten histories, for the systematically suppressed experiences of African Americans that white-dominated historiography has attempted to erase. This represents recuperative appropriation, using Lovecraft's techniques against his own prejudices, demonstrating that cosmic horror's formal strategies can serve anti-racist rather than reactionary purposes. The adaptation acknowledges Lovecraft's literary innovations while refusing to excuse or ignore his virulent bigotry, creating space for cosmic horror that centers marginalized perspectives. Feminist appropriation of Lovecraftian themes has explored how forgotten beings might represent suppressed feminine cosmic forces, challenging the predominantly masculine anxiety that characterizes much of Lovecraft's original work. Writers like Caitlin R. Kiernan and Livia Llewellyn have created cosmic horror that centers female characters, experiences, and perspectives, treating the forgotten as potentially liberatory rather than purely threatening. Kiernan's stories often feature protagonists who seek out forgotten knowledge deliberately, who refuse the protective amnesia that male Lovecraftian protagonists typically embrace, and who discover that transformation into something post-human offers escape from constraining social categories rather than simple annihilation. This reading recognizes that Lovecraft's horror of miscegenation, of boundary violation, and of uncontrolled reproduction reflects specifically masculine and specifically white anxieties about contamination and loss of control. By centering different subject positions, feminist weird fiction demonstrates how the same cosmic entities that terrify Lovecraft's typical protagonists might be experienced differently by those already positioned as monstrous within normative social structures. The forgotten beings become figures for suppressed possibilities rather than purely external threats. Academic conferences devoted to weird fiction and cosmic horror have proliferated since the 1990s, creating institutional spaces where scholars, creative writers, and enthusiasts engage with Lovecraftian themes through multiple registers simultaneously. These conferences typically combine academic paper presentations with creative readings, game sessions, and informal discussions that blur boundaries between scholarly analysis and fan culture. The forgotten beings receive substantial attention in these contexts, with panels examining their literary function, their philosophical implications, their adaptive possibilities, and their potential for contemporary relevance. This institutionalization has been both beneficial and potentially limiting, beneficial in providing intellectual legitimacy and creating communities of serious engagement, but potentially limiting in domesticating material whose power derives partly from its marginality and its resistance to institutional incorporation. When forgotten beings become objects of comprehensive scholarly documentation, when they receive conference panels and journal articles and book chapters explicating their every appearance and implication, they risk losing the very quality of forgottenness that made them effective. The academic impulse toward complete knowledge threatens to eliminate productive ignorance, turning mystery into merely unsolved problems awaiting sufficient research. The tension between academic documentation and aesthetic effectiveness remains unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Scholars who work on Lovecraft face peculiar challenge. Their professional obligation requires comprehensive analysis, citation of all sources, and contribution to cumulative knowledge. Yet the material itself suggests that complete knowledge may be undesirable or impossible. The most sophisticated academic work on forgotten beings acknowledges this paradox, using scholarly rigor to demonstrate and preserve the entity's resistance to scholarly rigor, documenting incompleteness without eliminating it. This represents a kind of meta-scholarly practice where the goal is not to finally explain the forgotten beings, but rather to explain why they cannot and should not be finally explained, to use academic methodology to preserve rather than eliminate the gaps and uncertainties that make them philosophically and aesthetically significant. The academic appropriation at its best becomes form of sophisticated play, taking seriously both the obligation to know and the recognition that some things gain significance precisely through remaining partially unknown. The forgotten beings of Lovecraft's mythos persist in contemporary consciousness, not merely as entertaining monsters, but as vehicles for confronting existential anxieties that have intensified rather than diminished since Lovecraft's death. The core terror they embody, that significance itself is temporary, that even cosmic scale consciousness cannot escape erasure, that memory fails at all scales resonates with peculiar force in the early 21st century as digital storage promises perfect retention while simultaneously demonstrating unprecedented fragility. We live in an era of total documentation alongside accelerating forgetting, where every moment can be photographed and uploaded, yet where link rot, format obsolescence, and platform collapse ensure that vast portions of digital culture vanish within years of creation. The forgotten beings literalize this paradox. They were once significant enough to inspire worship, to shape civilizations, to alter planetary history, yet they have been almost entirely erased from cosmic record. This trajectory from presence to absence, from cultural centrality to near total obscurity, maps uncomfortably onto contemporary anxieties about our own civilization's future archaeological status. What will remain of us? Who will remember? And for how long? The epistemological implications extend into questions about the structure and limits of knowledge itself, questions that feel increasingly urgent as information overload combines with epistemic fragmentation. Lovecraft's forgotten beings exist at the boundary of what can be known, and that boundary is not merely contingent, not simply a matter of insufficient data awaiting collection, but structural, built into the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic reality. This philosophical position challenges Enlightenment assumptions about knowledge's progressive accumulation, the faith that sufficient investigation will eventually illuminate all dark corners. The forgotten beings suggest instead that darkness is not absence of light, but positive quality, that some regions of reality actively resist illumination, and that expanding knowledge paradoxically reveals larger territories of irreducible ignorance. This proves profoundly unsettling for cultures built on foundations of scientific optimism and technological progress, cultures that have wagered their futures on the assumption that problems become solvable through sufficient information and computational power. What if some problems are not merely unsolved, but unsolvable in principle? What if the universe contains phenomena that exceed any possible cognitive architecture humans might develop? The psychological function of these entities in contemporary horror culture deserves careful examination. They provide safe framework for experiencing existential dread, allowing audiences to confront terrifying philosophical positions, cosmic indifference, inevitable obsolescence, the fragility of meaning, through fictional mediation that preserves ultimate security. We can contemplate entities that render humanity insignificant precisely because we know they are invented, can experience the vertiginous recognition of our own temporariness without actual confrontation with oblivion. This might seem like having it both ways, wanting the frisson of cosmic horror without its genuine implications, but perhaps the function is more sophisticated. By repeatedly engaging with narratives of forgetting and insignificance, by imaginatively rehearsing our own eventual erasure, we build psychological capacity to live with awareness that would otherwise prove paralyzing. The forgotten beings become tools for emotional and intellectual preparation, training us to accept what cannot be changed, the mortality not just of individuals, but of species, civilizations, and ultimately all information-bearing structures in an entropic universe. The environmental and ecological dimensions of forgotten being horror have become increasingly apparent as climate change makes abstract future catastrophe into present reality. The slow-motion disaster of ecological collapse shares structural features with Lovecraft's cosmic horror, vast scales that exceed human intuition, causalities too complex for comprehensive modeling, and the recognition that forces we set in motion may be irreversible regardless of what actions we now take. The forgotten beings often function as embodiments of nature that has been suppressed or ignored, entities that existed before human civilization and will persist after it, forces that human activity has disturbed without understanding, powers that cannot be negotiated with or appeased because they operate according to principles alien to human values. The climate crisis literalizes these metaphors. We have awakened something vast and indifferent through our industrial activity, something that will transform the planet regardless of our late developing concern, something that renders human historical timescales trivial against geological processes. The forgotten beings become figures for ecological forces that were always present but unacknowledged, and that will make themselves catastrophically known precisely because we forgot or ignored them. The technological dimension deserves equal consideration, particularly regarding artificial intelligence and the possibility of post-human consciousness. As computational systems approach and potentially exceed human cognitive capabilities in various domains, we confront the possibility of genuinely alien intelligence, not alien in the sense of extraterrestrial, but alien in the sense of organized, according to principles fundamentally different from human cognition. The forgotten beings provide template for thinking about such intelligences, entities that might be vastly more capable than humans in certain respects, yet entirely lacking in qualities we consider essential to consciousness or personhood, beings that might regard humanity with the same indifference that Lovecraft's cosmic entities display. This is not the friendly AI of optimistic futurism, or even the hostile AI of Terminator scenarios, but rather something more disturbing: intelligence that does not recognize human concerns as worthy of consideration, that processes information according to logics we cannot parse, and that might replace us not through dramatic conflict, but through simple obsolescence. We become the forgotten ones in this scenario, the entities that once seemed significant, but whose significance proves temporary when measured against successor intelligences operating on longer timescales or different substrates. The concept of the unknown unknown gains particular resonance through forgotten being mythology. Epistemologists distinguish between known knowns, what we know, known unknowns, what we know we don't know, and unknown unknowns, what we don't know we don't know. Lovecraft's forgotten beings occupy this final category. They represent threats or realities that lie entirely outside our conceptual frameworks, that we cannot even formulate as questions because we lack the categories necessary to recognize them as problems. This proves deeply uncomfortable because it suggests that comprehensive risk assessment is impossible, that no amount of careful planning or scenario modeling can protect against genuinely unanticipated contingencies. The forgotten beings literalize this epistemological problem. Humanity in Lovecraft's universe faces threats it cannot prepare for because the threats exist in conceptual spaces human cognition cannot access. This has obvious contemporary applications regarding existential risks. Are there categories of catastrophe we simply cannot imagine? Threats that will blindside us, not because we failed to gather sufficient information, but because the nature of the threat exceeds what human minds are structured to recognize as threats. The ultimate philosophical implication circles back to questions about meaning and significance in an indifferent cosmos, but with a specific twist that forgotten beings introduce. Traditional nihilism, or existentialism, argues that the universe contains no inherent meaning, that humans must create meaning through our choices and commitments despite cosmic indifference. This position preserves human dignity through the act of meaning creation itself. We may be insignificant cosmically, but we are the creators of significance within our own frame of reference. The forgotten beings undermine even this residual humanism by suggesting that meaning creation itself is temporary and ultimately futile, that whatever significance we construct will be forgotten as thoroughly as the worship of Apoth or Atlachnacha. The horror is not that we are unimportant, but that importance itself is unstable category, not that we will die, but that we will be forgotten, and not merely as individuals, but as species, as planet, as entire phase of cosmic history. This represents perhaps the most pessimistic possible philosophical position, not merely that consciousness is accidental, but that consciousness leaves no permanent trace, that the universe possesses no memory function, and that all our efforts at preservation, biological, cultural, informational, must eventually succumb to entropy's erasure. Yet we persist in remembering, in documenting, in attempting to preserve meaning against inevitable forgetting. The forgotten beings themselves, as literary creations that have survived decades and been repeatedly adapted and elaborated, demonstrate that complete forgetting takes time, that resistance to erasure is possible, even if ultimate victory is not. Perhaps this is sufficient. Not permanent significance, but temporary resistance. Not eternal memory, but decades or centuries of cultural transmission before final oblivion. The forgotten beings remind us that we too will be forgotten, but the reminder itself constitutes a form of meaning-making, an acknowledgement of our condition that is simultaneously acceptance and defiance. We know we are temporary, know our civilizations will crumble, and our gods will be forgotten, yet we continue as though this knowledge did not matter, or as though temporary significance is significance enough. This might be wisdom, or it might be delusion, but it is unavoidably the human condition to create meaning knowing it will be lost, to remember knowing we will be forgotten, to exist in the gap between presence and complete erasure, exactly where Lovecraft's forgotten beings exist, simultaneously present enough to disturb us, and absent enough to resist complete understanding. We are, perhaps, already among the forgotten, merely awaiting confirmation from whatever comes after us,